The morning mist clings to the Seine as December 2nd, 1804 dawns over Paris. In the great cathedral of Notre Dame, centuries of French monarchy seem to hold their breath. The Gothic arches have witnessed the prayers of kings, the tears of queens, the whispered confessions of dynasties now dust. But today they witness something unprecedented. Napoleon Bonaparte stands before the altar, but he is no longer the slight Corsican artillery officer who once studied maps by candlelight in his sparse quarters. At 35, he has already conquered Italy, crossed the Alps, seized power in the coup of 18 Brumaire, and transformed himself from first consul to consul for life. Now, in this sacred space where Charlemagne might have knelt, he prepares to take the final step. Pope Pius VII sits nearby, his elderly hands folded, his face a mask of diplomatic resignation. The Pope has traveled from Rome for this ceremony, but he knows, as does everyone in this cathedral, that his presence is merely ceremonial. The real power, the divine mandate that Napoleon claims, comes not from heaven but from his own iron will and the loyalty of his Grande Armée. The crown sits upon a velvet cushion. It is not the ancient crown of Charlemagne, though Napoleon had considered it. Instead, it is a new creation, crafted by the jeweler Marguerite, its golden laurel leaves echoing the crowns of Roman emperors. Augustus, Caesar, Marcus Aurelius. Their ghosts seem to whisper approval as Napoleon's gloved hand reaches for the circlet of power. The assembled dignitaries hold their breath. Foreign ambassadors lean forward in their seats. Some represent nations that have already felt the sting of French bayonets: Austria, whose armies Napoleon scattered at Rivoli and Austerlitz; Prussia, nervously watching this Corsican upstart claim imperial dignity; Russia, whose Tsar Alexander maintains an uneasy peace with this revolutionary France. Josephine waits beside him, resplendent in white silk and diamonds, her own crown ready. She who captured his heart in the salons of Paris, who waded through his Egyptian campaign, who has seen him rise from general to consul to this. Her dark eyes reflect the cathedral's candles as she watches her husband prepare to make himself equal to the Caesars. Napoleon lifts the crown. The cathedral falls silent except for the soft shuffling of silk and the distant echo of Paris beyond the doors. With deliberate slowness, savoring this moment that transforms not just himself but the very nature of European power, he places the crown upon his own head. The symbolism is unmistakable. No pope crowns him. No archbishop of Reims performs the ancient ritual of French kings. Napoleon crowns himself, declaring to Europe and to history that his authority comes from his own genius, his own victories, his own destiny. It is a gesture that repudiates 1,000 years of tradition, that sends shockwaves through every royal court from London to St. Petersburg. "Josephine," he murmurs, and she kneels before him. With tender hands, these same hands that have signed death warrants and planned the destruction of armies. He places the smaller crown upon her dark hair. She rises as Empress of the French, no longer merely the wife of a consul but the partner of an emperor. The Te Deum rises from the choir, voices soaring toward the vaulted ceiling. But beneath the sacred music, one can almost hear the grinding of the great wheel of European history as it turns toward a new age. The revolution, which began with the storming of the Bastille, has found its Caesar. The Republic, which guillotined one king, has created another. Outside Notre Dame, Paris celebrates. The streets fill with citizens who remember the terror, who lived through the Directory, who have seen their young republic survive foreign invasion and internal chaos. To them, Napoleon is not just an emperor, he is the man who brought order from anarchy, who made France feared and respected across the continent. But in the embassies and palaces of Europe, diplomats write urgent dispatches. The Corsican has gone too far. This self-coronation is not just presumption, it is a declaration of war against the old order. Kings rule by divine right, inherited through centuries of bloodline. Napoleon rules by right of conquest, by the will of the people, by the law of talent over birth. In Vienna, Emperor Francis II of Austria reads the reports with growing alarm. This French upstart now claims to be his equal, to stand alongside the heir of the Holy Roman Empire. In London, Prime Minister William Pitt studies the intelligence from Paris and begins to calculate the cost of a new coalition. In St. Petersburg, Tsar Alexander paces his palace halls, wondering if his fragile peace with France can survive this new imperial ambition. The ceremony concludes, but its echoes will reverberate across Europe for the next decade. As the imperial couple emerges from Notre Dame, the cheers of the Parisian crowd mingle with the thunder of artillery salutes. The guns that once defended the revolution now herald an empire. That evening, in the Tuileries Palace, Napoleon stands before a mirror in his private chambers. The crown sits on a nearby table, its gold catching the firelight. He is no longer General Bonaparte, no longer First Consul. He is Napoleon I, Emperor of the French, and in his mind, he can already see the map of Europe redrawn in French blue. Josephine enters quietly, her own crown now locked away in the imperial treasury. "Do you think they will accept it?" she asks, her voice soft with concern. "The other monarchs?" Napoleon turns from the mirror, and for a moment, the mask of imperial dignity slips. She sees not the emperor but the man ambitious, brilliant, driven by dreams that dwarf ordinary mortals. "They will have no choice," he whispers. "I will make them accept it." Outside, the winter wind carries the scent of change across the rooftops of Paris. In 1,000 villages across France, peasants who once bowed to feudal lords now sleep as citizens of an empire. In the barracks of the Grande Armée, soldiers who once fought for liberty now march for glory. And in the chancelleries of Europe, ministers work by lamplight, preparing for the wars they know must come. The die is cast. The Republic is dead. Long live the empire. And at its head stands a man who dared to crown himself, who transformed revolution into destiny, who will carry the eagles of France from the sands of Egypt to the snows of Moscow. But that is tomorrow's story. Tonight, Paris sleeps under the protection of its new emperor, and Europe holds its breath, waiting for the storm that must surely follow. 2. Wars of the Third and Fourth Coalitions, 1805 to 1807. Europe trembled, and Napoleon smiled. The ink has barely dried on the imperial proclamations when the chancelleries of Europe begin their deadly dance. In the map room of the Tuileries, Napoleon spreads before him the great charts of the continent: Austria in Habsburg yellow, Prussia in Prussian blue, Russia stretching endlessly eastward in pale green. His finger traces the borders, calculating distances, counting armies, measuring the heartbeat of nations that dare to challenge his crown. Winter fades into spring, and with it comes the inevitable. By April 1805, the Third Coalition has crystallized around a simple premise. The upstart emperor must be stopped before his revolutionary contagion spreads further. Britain, that perpetual enemy across the Channel, opens her treasury once again. Gold flows like water to Vienna and St. Petersburg, British guineas to pay for Austrian muskets and Russian bayonets. In the Hofburg Palace, Emperor Francis II of Austria signs the treaty with hands that remember signing the humiliating Peace of Campo Formio 8 years earlier. This time, he tells himself, this time will be different. The Austrian army has been reformed, retrained, re-equipped. General Mack von Lieberich, confident and capable, commands nearly 100,000 men. Surely this force, combined with Russian reinforcements marching westward under Kutuzov, can crush the Corsican upstart. But Napoleon, pacing the gardens of Malmaison in the pre-dawn hours of summer 1805, sees the coalition's weakness with the clarity of genius. Distance, time, coordination. 3 allies separated by hundreds of miles, moving at the pace of marching infantry, communicating by dispatch riders who take weeks to carry messages between capitals. He, by contrast, commands a unified force, a Grande Armée forged in the fires of revolution and tempered by his own iron discipline. The transformation of the Army of England into the Grande Armée happens with startling swiftness. Along the coast at Boulogne, where Napoleon has spent months preparing for the invasion of Britain, 200,000 men await his word. They have drilled in the sand, practiced amphibious landings, built a flotilla of barges to carry them across the Channel. But now, in August 1805, new orders crackle through the camps like electricity. L'Angleterre put a tendre, Napoleon tells his marshals as they gather in his command tent. England can wait. The eagles turn eastward. The march begins on August 26th, and it is a thing of beauty, a military ballet choreographed by the greatest strategic mind of the age. 7 corps stream across France like fingers of a closing fist, each moving along predetermined routes, each arriving at precisely calculated times and places. Davout's 3 corps, the Iron Marshal's men, march 15th miles a day in perfect order. Soult's 4 corps follows the Rhine, while Ney's 6 corps sweeps through the Black Forest. Each column is a small army in itself, 25,000 men with their own artillery, cavalry, supply trains. In Vienna, the reports trickle in slowly, filtered through layers of Austrian bureaucracy. The French are moving, yes, but where? How many? Austrian intelligence, hampered by outdated methods and wishful thinking, cannot grasp the scope or speed of Napoleon's concentration. General Mack, confident in his fortress of Ulm, believes he faces perhaps 70,000 Frenchmen. The true number, nearly 200,000 converging on him like wolves on a wounded deer, remains hidden behind Napoleon's masterful deception. By October, the trap is sprung with mathematical precision. While Austrian eyes remain fixed on the Black Forest, expecting a frontal assault, the Grande Army sweeps around them in a vast arc. Murat's cavalry screens the movement, his troopers in their brilliant uniforms drawing Austrian attention while the real blow falls elsewhere. Lannes captures the bridges over the Danube. Soult cuts the road to Vienna. Ney closes the circle from the north. Mack awakens on October 14th to find himself surrounded. The fortress of Ulm, which he had chosen as his base precisely because it commanded the approaches from France, has become his prison. 30,000 Austrian soldiers, the cream of the Habsburg army, trapped like fish in a net by an enemy they never saw coming. The negotiations are brief. Mack, his face ashen with the realization of disaster, requests terms. Napoleon, magnanimous in victory, offers them gladly. On October 20th, the Austrian garrison marches out of Ulm and lays down their arms. Regimental colors that have flown from Prague to Mantua are handed over to French sergeants. Officers who traced their lineage to the Crusades surrender their swords to men who were peasants or shopkeepers a decade ago. Napoleon watches from horseback as the defeated columns pass. His gray overcoat, already famous across Europe, flaps in the autumn wind. To his staff, he seems almost bored by this latest triumph. 40,000 prisoners, he murmurs to Berthier, his chief of staff, and we have not yet fired a shot in anger, but the celebration is premature. Even as the Austrians surrender at Ulm, the Russians are approaching. Kutuzov, that old fox of the steppes, marches westward with 50,000 veterans. More concerning still, the Austrians have not collapsed entirely. Archduke Charles, the one Habsburg general Napoleon respects, commands another army in Italy. And from the north, Prussia watches with growing alarm and calculating eyes. The pursuit begins immediately. The Grande Armée, intoxicated by its easy victory, streams eastward toward Vienna, the Austrian capital, that ancient seat of empire, that city of Mozart and Metternich, awaits its fate with the resignation of centuries. Emperor Francis and his court flee to Olmütz, abandoning palaces that have sheltered Habsburg emperors since the Middle Ages. On November 13th, French cavalry clatter across the cobblestones of the Ringstrasse. The occupation is almost gentle. Napoleon has given strict orders regarding the treatment of civilians. French soldiers, many of them veterans of the Italian campaigns, marvel at the Baroque splendor of the Hofburg, at the magnificence of Schönbrunn Palace. Some remember the poverty of their youth, the empty bellies and tattered clothes of their revolutionary childhoods. Now they stand as conquerors in the most beautiful city in Europe. But Vienna is merely a prize, not the objective. Somewhere to the northeast, Kutuzov's Russians have joined with the remnants of the Austrian army. Emperor Francis and Tsar Alexander, those two autocrats who claim to rule by divine right, have come together to face the upstart who crowned himself. The Allied army, Russians, Austrians, a few Prussian observers, numbers nearly 90,000 men. They choose their ground carefully, the rolling hills near a small Moravian village called Austerlitz. December 1st, 1805. 1 year and 1 day after his coronation, Napoleon rides across the battlefield that will make his name immortal. The morning mist clings to the valleys, and in that mist, his enemies prepare their trap. The Allied plan is elegant in its simplicity. Pin the French right wing while launching a massive assault on the left, rolling up Napoleon's line like a carpet. Kutuzov, veteran of Turkish wars and Polish campaigns, has positioned his men with the skill of decades. But Napoleon sees what they cannot: opportunity hidden within apparent disaster. As the Allied columns descend from the Pratzen Heights to attack his deliberately weakened left flank, they expose their center. It is a gamble worthy of Caesar, a calculated risk that will either destroy his army or shatter the coalition. In the pre-dawn darkness, he rides among his men, the same gray coat, the same calm voice that has led them from the pyramids of Egypt to the gates of Vienna. Soldiers, his words carry across the ranks, I will direct your battalions in person. Keep out of the firing line if you see me exposed to the fire of the enemy. But if victory should for a moment be in doubt, you will see your emperor expose himself in front rank, for victory must not hesitate. The sun rises through the mist at 8 a.m., revealing the deployed armies in all their splendor. Russian grenadiers in tall mitres, Austrian whitecoats in perfect lines, French soldiers in blue and white, their eagles glinting in the morning light. For a moment, the scene has the quality of a painting, all pageantry and martial beauty. Before the guns begin their deadly work, the attack comes as expected. Bagration's Russians assault the village of Telnitz while Buxhouden's columns strike at Sokolnitz. The French left, under Davout and Lens, bends but does not break. Napoleon watches from his command post, a small hill that offers a clear view of the developing battle. His staff shifts nervously. The emperor's plan requires nerves of steel and perfect timing. At 9 a.m. he gives the order. Soult's 4 Corps, hidden in the morning mist, surges up the slopes of the Pratzen Heights. The Allied center, stripped of troops to feed the assault on the French left, crumbles before the unexpected attack. Russian and Austrian battalions, caught in column formation and unable to deploy, are swept away by the French advance. The battle becomes a rout with stunning swiftness. Kutuzov, wounded and nearly captured, watches his careful plans dissolve in chaos. Tsar Alexander, his face pale with shock, sees the cream of his army shattered in a single morning. The ice of the Satschan pond cracks under the weight of fleeing soldiers, drowning men who have survived the Turkish wars only to perish in a Moravian marsh. By afternoon, it is over. The coalition has lost 27,000 men killed, wounded, captured. The French casualties barely number 8,000. Napoleon, his face illuminated by the glow of burning gun carriages, dictates his bulletin to the army. Soldiers, I am pleased with you. In the Battle of Austerlitz, you have justified all that I expected from your intrepidity. The political consequences unfold with the same inexorable logic as the battle itself. Austria, humiliated for the 3rd time in a decade, sues for peace. The Treaty of Pressburg, signed on December 26th, strips the Habsburgs of Venetia, Tyrol, and their remaining German territories. The Holy Roman Empire, that 1,000-year-old ghost of Charlemagne's legacy, finally expires as Francis renounces the title that connects him to the Caesars. But even as one coalition dies, another stirs to life. In Berlin, King Frederick William III reads the reports from Austerlitz with growing alarm. Prussia, that military state built by the great Frederick, cannot indefinitely remain neutral while French power grows unchecked. The war party, led by Queen Louise, beautiful, passionate, determined whispers of honor and duty. Prussian officers, proud heirs of Luthen and Rossbach, speak contemptuously of the French rabble and their Corsican general. Napoleon, returning to Paris in triumph, understands the logic of power. Each victory creates new enemies, each conquest new coalitions. But he is intoxicated by success, convinced of his own destiny. In the Tuileries, he spreads the maps once more. Austria is prostrate. Russia retreats beyond the Niemen. Only Prussia remains, and Prussia, that relic of the previous century with its powdered officers and antiquated tactics, surely cannot stand against the Grande Armée. The summer of 1806 passes in diplomatic maneuvering. Britain, frustrated by the collapse of her latest coalition, seeks new allies. Russian agents whisper promises of support to Prussian diplomats. In the salons of Berlin, patriotic fervor builds like steam in a boiler. Queen Louise, her beauty matched only by her hatred of Napoleon, becomes the symbol of Prussian resistance. By September, the die is cast once more. Prussia mobilizes her army's 150,000 men under the Duke of Brunswick, veteran of the victories against revolutionary France in the 1790s. They march with the confidence of Frederick the Great's heirs, their formations perfect, their discipline immaculate. At Jena and Auerstedt, two separate battles fought on the same October day, they learn that discipline without adaptation is merely a beautiful form of suicide. The Grande Armée has evolved since Austerlitz. Napoleon's marshals Davout, Lannes, Augereau, Ney have become masters of their craft. The soldiers, veterans now of multiple campaigns, move with the easy confidence of professionals. When the Prussians attack in the formations of Frederick the Great, they meet not the revolutionary levies of the 1790s but the finest military machine in Europe. The destruction is complete. In a single day, Prussia's military power is shattered. Brunswick falls, mortally wounded. The Prussian army dissolves in panic and rout. Within a week, French cavalry are clattering through the streets of Berlin, and Napoleon stands in the palace of Frederick the Great, contemplating the sword and decorations of his departed idol. Yet even in triumph, the seeds of future conflict are sown. The Prussian army is destroyed, but the Prussian state survives. In East Prussia, refugees tell tales of French brutality. In Russia, Tsar Alexander reads the reports from Germany and prepares for the inevitable confrontation. The Fourth Coalition is already forming, even as the Third Coalition's corpse still lies warm. The candle flickers lower, casting dancing shadows across the maps. In the distance, we can almost hear the echo of marching feet, the rumble of artillery, the clash of empires in collision. 3. Reforms and Codes, 1804 to 1808. He did not merely conquer territories, he conquered time itself. Between the thunder of cannons and the clash of cavalry sabers, in the quiet hours when Europe catches its breath between battles, Napoleon performs his greatest miracle. Not on the fields of Austerlitz or the streets of Berlin, but in the lamplit chambers of the Tuileries, surrounded by law books and administrative reports, he builds something that will outlast all his military victories, the architecture of the modern state. The morning of March 17, 1804 finds Napoleon in his study, still in his nightgown, poring over manuscripts that will change the world. Before him lie the fruits of 4 years' labor, 2,281 articles of law that will become the Code Civil, soon to be known as the Code Napoleon. His secretary, Meneval, sits nearby, cool-poised, ready to capture the emperor's thoughts as they flow like water finding its course. Listen to this, Napoleon murmurs, his finger tracing a particular passage. The exercise of civil rights is independent of political rights, which are acquired and maintained according to constitutional laws. The words seem simple, almost mundane, but their implications ripple across centuries. In these quiet syllables lies the death of the old world, where rights belong to nobles by birth and peasants by sufferance. The creation of the Civil Code has been Napoleon's obsession since his days as first consul. While his marshals dream of glory and his ministers calculate revenues, he has spent countless hours with the greatest legal minds of France: Tronchet, Bigot-Priaminu, Portalis, Mailleville. These men, some royalists, some republicans, some survivors of the terror, have found common ground in their emperor's vision of law as the foundation of society. The sessions are legendary among those privileged to witness them. Napoleon, pacing before the fireplace in the council chamber, argues points of jurisprudence with the passion he usually reserves for military strategy. Property, he declares on one memorable evening, is the foundation of social order, but it must be property earned by merit, not inherited privilege. Portalis nods approvingly while Tronchet raises a cautious objection about traditional customs. These are not merely legal discussions. They are the forge in which a new France is being hammered into shape. Each article of the code represents a choice, a decision about what kind of society shall emerge from the ashes of the revolution. Shall marriage be a sacrament or a contract? Shall fathers have absolute authority or shall wives possess independent rights? Shall the state or the church control education? Napoleon's answers echo through every provision. Marriage becomes a civil contract, dissoluble by mutual consent. Women gain property rights undreamed of under the Ancien regime, though they remain subordinate to their husbands in matters of law. Children born outside marriage receive protection, though not equality with legitimate heirs. Each compromise reflects the emperor's pragmatic genius, revolutionary enough to destroy the old order, conservative enough to provide stability. The code's influence spreads like ripples from a stone cast in still water. As French armies march across Europe, they carry with them not only imperial eagles but legal principles that will reshape the continent. In the German states, princes who have submitted to Napoleon's will find their subjects demanding the same legal protections enjoyed by French citizens. In Italy, where the code is adopted wholesale, centuries of feudal law crumble before its logical architecture. But law is only one pillar of Napoleon's domestic revolution. Education, that great democratizer of talent, receives equal attention. In the gilded halls of Fontainebleau, surrounded by the ghosts of French kings, Napoleon signs the decree establishing the University of France, a centralized system that will channel the nation's intellectual energy toward imperial purposes. I want to be able to say, he tells his Minister of Education, show me the map of France, and I can tell you what is being taught at this very hour in every school in the empire. The vision is breathtaking in its scope: 30,000 schools, from village elementary institutions to the great lycées of Paris, all following standardized curricula, all producing citizens educated in mathematics, science, literature, and above all, loyalty to the empire. The lycées become Napoleon's particular pride. These secondary schools, established in major cities across France, create a new aristocracy, not of blood but of brains. The sons of merchants and farmers sit alongside the children of nobles, all earning their places through competitive examination. Latin and Greek provide the classical foundation, but mathematics and science receive equal emphasis. These young men will become the administrators, officers, and engineers of the empire. In the Brittany Military School, formerly the Jesuit College of La Flèche, Napoleon establishes a template for elite education that will influence military training worldwide. Cadets rise at dawn, study until late evening, learn not only tactics and strategy but literature, philosophy, and the arts. I want officers who can write as well as they can fight, the emperor declares, who can govern provinces as skillfully as they command regiments. The Concordat with Pope Pius VII, signed in 1801 but implemented throughout these years, represents perhaps Napoleon's most delicate balancing act. The Catholic Church, wounded but not destroyed by the revolution, must be reintegrated into French society without surrendering the state's supremacy. In the lamplit negotiations at the Vatican, Napoleon's diplomats weave a careful compromise. The Church regains its right to public worship and religious education. Priests, no longer elected by their congregations as during the Revolution's radical phase, receive their authority from bishops appointed by the state. The vast church lands confiscated during the Revolution remain in the hands of their new owners, mostly bourgeois buyers who form a crucial pillar of Napoleon's support. It is a masterpiece of practical politics, satisfying neither extreme Catholics nor militant secularists, but providing the stability France desperately needs. Sunday mornings across France witness the Concordat's success. In village churches rebuilt with imperial funds, priests appointed by Napoleon's government celebrate Mass while prefects appointed by his administration maintain order in the squares outside. The old alliance of throne and altar has been replaced by something more complex but equally enduring. An empire that is neither secular nor theocratic but pragmatically both. The administrative revolution proceeds with mathematical precision. The ancient provinces of France, Normandy, Provence, Burgundy, disappear into history, replaced by 83 departments whose borders ignore traditional loyalties in favor of administrative efficiency. Each department is governed by a prefect, appointed by the emperor, responsible directly to Paris. No longer can regional nobles claim hereditary authority over their ancestral domains. In the prefecture of the Seine, the transformation is most visible. Baron Haussmann's later work will be anticipated by Napoleon's own vision of Paris as an imperial capital. Streets are widened, sewers constructed, public buildings erected. The medieval tangle of narrow alleys that once sheltered revolutionary mobs gives way to broad boulevards suitable for imperial processions, and, if necessary, artillery fire. The economic reforms complement the legal and administrative changes. The Bank of France, established in 1800, provides financial stability that France has not known since the monarchy's collapse. The continental system, Napoleon's response to British economic warfare, may ultimately prove ruinous. But in these early years it stimulates French industry by excluding British competition. In Lyon, silk manufacturers prosper behind the protective wall of the continental system. In Lille, cotton mills hum with activity as French textiles replace British imports across Europe. The emperor personally tours these facilities, questioning workers about their conditions, consulting with owners about production methods. His gray coat becomes a familiar sight in factory courtyards where the future of industrial France is being forged. The Legion of Honor, established in 1802, represents Napoleon's most subtle social innovation. This order of merit, open to soldiers and civilians alike, creates a new hierarchy based on service rather than birth. The red ribbon becomes more coveted than any ducal coronet, for it represents the emperor's personal recognition of excellence. In the Invalides, that magnificent monument to Louis XIV military glory, Napoleon establishes the ceremony that will echo through French history. Veterans of Marengo and Austerlitz receive their decorations from the emperor's own hand, while military bands play the martial airs that have carried French armies from the Nile to the Danube. It is with trinkets that men are led, Napoleon observes, but these particular trinkets carry the weight of imperial approval. The transformation extends even to the most intimate aspects of daily life. The revolutionary calendar, with its decades instead of weeks and its rejection of Christian names for months, yields to practical necessity. Saints' days return, not from religious conviction but from administrative efficiency. Farmers need to know when to plant and harvest, merchants when to hold their markets. The emperor's pragmatism trumps revolutionary ideology once again. Marriage customs, funeral rites, even fashion reflect the new order. The elaborate court dress of the Ancien Regime returns in modified form, not the silk stockings and powdered wigs of Versailles, but the elegant uniforms and formal gowns appropriate to an imperial court. Josephine, ever conscious of her role as empress, sets fashion standards that influence styles across Europe. In the workshops of Paris, artisans create the furniture and decorations of the empire style, clean lines inspired by ancient Rome, bronze and gold fittings that speak of military victory, motifs drawn from Egyptian campaigns and German conquests. Every chair and table proclaims the glory of the regime. Every architectural detail reinforces the message of imperial authority. The road system, inherited from the monarchy but revolutionized under the empire, carries more than military traffic. Along the great highways radiating from Paris, ideas flow as freely as goods. Merchants from Marseille carry news of Italian campaigns to the textile workers of Rouen. Administrators trained in Parisian lycées bring modern methods to provincial capitals. The empire becomes a vast circulation system with the emperor's will as its beating heart. Statistics, that new science of administration, flourish under Napoleon's patronage. In government offices across France, clerks compile reports on population, production, tax revenues, military recruitment. The emperor demands precise information about everything from grain harvests to birth rates, from highway conditions to public health. Knowledge becomes power, and power serves the imperial vision. The effect of these domestic reforms extends far beyond France's borders. In the German states of the Confederation of the Rhine, rulers impose French-inspired legal codes. In the Kingdom of Italy, Napoleon's stepson Eugene implements educational reforms modeled on the French system. In the Grand Duchy of Warsaw, Polish nobles discover that French law protects their serfs more effectively than Polish tradition ever did. Even Napoleon's enemies acknowledge the power of his domestic achievements. In London, Whig politicians study the Code Napoleon and find principles worthy of adoption. In Vienna, Austrian ministers secretly envy the administrative efficiency of their French rivals. In St. Petersburg, Russian intellectuals read French legal treatises and dream of similar reforms for their own backward empire. But perhaps the most lasting achievement is the creation of the modern civil service, a professional bureaucracy selected by merit rather than birth or connection. In the offices of every ministry, clerks and administrators work according to standardized procedures, their authority derived not from personal relationships but from institutional position. It is a quiet revolution, less dramatic than military victories but more enduring in its consequences. As 1808 dawns, the domestic transformation approaches completion. France has become a machine of unprecedented efficiency, every gear calibrated to serve the imperial purpose. From the village school where children learn to read using texts that praise the emperor's victories, to the great law courts where judges apply legal principles that will influence jurisprudence for centuries, Napoleon's domestic revolution touches every aspect of French life. The boy from Corsica has indeed conquered time itself, creating institutions that will survive the collapse of his military empire and influence human civilization long after the last veteran of Austerlitz has returned to dust. In the candlelight, we see the outline of a different kind of victory, not measured in kilometers of territory but in the transformation of human possibilities. 4. Empire at its peak, 1809 to 1810. At the summit of power, he touched the stars. But stars, like empires, eventually fall. The year 1809 dawns with the sound of Austrian drums echoing across the Danube. In the Hofburg Palace, Archduke Charles unfurls his war plans with the methodical precision that has made him the most respected Habsburg general. Austria, humiliated at Austerlitz, stripped of territory at Pressburg, has spent 4 years rebuilding her armies. Now, with Napoleon distracted by the ulcer of Spain, Vienna believes the moment has come for revenge. But Emperor Francis miscalculates the man he faces. In the study of Schönbrunn Palace, irony of ironies, the same rooms where Habsburg emperors once planned the destruction of revolutionary France, Napoleon spreads his maps with the calm confidence of a chess master who sees victory 20 moves ahead. The Austrian army may be reformed, retrained, and re-equipped, but it still moves with the ponderous predictability of the old world. The campaign unfolds with the inevitability of a mathematical equation. While Archduke Charles masses his forces along the Inn River, Napoleon strikes with lightning swiftness at Ratisbon, splitting the Austrian army and driving wedges between its scattered corps. At Eckmühl, French artillery tears gaps in Austrian lines that once stood firm against Turkish janissaries and Prussian grenadiers. The white-coated regiments that had served the Habsburgs for centuries dissolve under the hammer blows of the Grande Armée. By May 13th, French cavalry are once again clattering through the streets of Vienna. But this time, the occupation carries a different weight. Napoleon is no longer the upstart consul seeking legitimacy. He is the master of Europe, and Austria is merely the latest petitioner for his mercy. In the Hofburg's mirrored halls, where Mozart once played for Emperor Joseph II, French officers now dictate terms to Austrian archdukes. Yet Archduke Charles, that most tenacious of Napoleon's opponents, refuses to acknowledge defeat. Across the Danube, in the plains of Marchfeld where Rudolf of Habsburg once defeated Ottokar of Bohemia, the Austrian army reforms like a wounded beast gathering strength for one final strike. Charles knows this will be his last chance. If he cannot stop Napoleon here, Austria will become a French satellite forever. The crossing of the Danube becomes Napoleon's greatest gamble since the march to Austerlitz. The river runs high with spring floods, its current swift enough to drag away men and horses. Austrian artillery commands the far shore, while Charles has positioned his army with all the skill of a lifetime study of warfare. For the first time in years, Napoleon faces an enemy who holds both tactical and strategic advantages. The first assault, launched on May 21st at the villages of Aspern and Essling, meets disaster. Massena's corps, isolated on the north bank when the river destroys the French bridges, fights with desperate valor against overwhelming odds. For 2 days, 23,000 Frenchmen hold off 95,000 Austrians in a combat of unprecedented ferocity. Marshal Lannes, Napoleon's oldest friend, falls with a cannonball wound that will prove mortal. In his tent beside the broken bridge, Napoleon sits with Lens as life ebbs from the marshal who has shared his rise from the siege of Acre to the triumph of Jena. Jean, the emperor whispers, using the familiar name of their youth, "Do you recognize me? It is Bonaparte, your friend." Lens, his face pale but his eyes still bright with intelligence, grips Napoleon's hand. Their friendship, forged in the fires of revolution, ends in the smoke of gunpowder and the whisper of last words. The retreat from Ospernessling sends shockwaves across Europe. For the first time, Napoleon has been beaten in a pitched battle. In London, church bells ring to celebrate the news. In Berlin, Prussian officers speak openly of revenge. In St. Petersburg, Tsar Alexander reads the dispatches with calculating interest. The myth of French invincibility lies wounded, perhaps mortally, in the marshes of the Danube. But Napoleon, retreating to the island of Lobau like a wounded lion to its den, uses defeat as a teacher rather than a judge. For 6 weeks, while Europe holds its breath, he reinforces his position with the methodical precision that has made him master of the continent. Artillery parks grow like forests on the island. Engineers construct bridges that even the Danube's fury cannot destroy. Fresh troops march from every corner of the empire, Italians from the Po Valley, Germans from the Confederation of the Rhine, Poles dreaming of restored independence. On the night of July 4th, under cover of a thunderstorm that drowns the sound of marching feet, Napoleon launches his return to the North Bank. This time, he brings not 23,000 men but 180,000, the largest army he has ever commanded. The crossing, executed in darkness and rain, demonstrates the maturation of French military art. Pontoon bridges span the flood in hours rather than days. Artillery positions appear as if by magic. By dawn, the Grande Armée stands deployed on Austrian soil like an avenging angel. The Battle of Wagram, fought on July 5th and 6th, becomes Napoleon's masterpiece of artillery warfare. While Austrian columns advance with the mechanical precision of parade ground drill, French guns tear bloody furrows through their ranks. MacDonald's corps, advancing in a massive column supported by 100 cannon, smashes through the Austrian center like a steel wedge splitting oak. The sound of gunfire carries to Vienna, 20 miles away, where citizens huddle in their cellars and pray for deliverance. Archduke Charles, watching his army crumble under the French bombardment, makes the hardest decision of his military career. The white flag rises over Austrian headquarters, and with it dies the last hope of Habsburg resistance. Austria, that ancient enemy of France, that guardian of European legitimacy, acknowledges defeat and begs for terms. The Treaty of Schönbrunn, signed in October 1809, strips Austria of her last pretensions to great power status. Carinthia and Carniola go to Napoleon's Illyrian provinces. Salzburg passes to Bavaria. The Austrian Tyrol, despite the heroic resistance of Andreas Hofer and his mountaineers, becomes part of the Kingdom of Italy. Most crushing of all, Austria's access to the sea disappears as Trieste becomes French. But Napoleon's greatest victory is not territorial, it is diplomatic. In the gilded salons of Schönbrunn, where Marie Antoinette once played with her children, Austrian ministers whisper of a different kind of alliance. Emperor Francis, faced with the choice between annihilation and accommodation, chooses survival. The discussions that follow will reshape European dynasties and create a bond that Napoleon believes will secure his empire for generations. The decision to divorce Josephine comes not from lack of love but from inexorable political logic. In the private apartments of the Tuileries, Napoleon paces before portraits of French kings while wrestling with the hardest choice of his life. Josephine, now 46, has given him everything except the one thing an emperor must have: an heir. The empire needs a successor, and European legitimacy demands a dynastic marriage. The divorce ceremony, conducted in December 1809, possesses a dignity that reflects their mutual respect. Josephine, reading from a prepared statement with tears streaming down her face, declares her willingness to sacrifice personal happiness for the good of France. Napoleon, his own voice breaking with emotion, confirms his eternal gratitude for her devotion. They part as they began, with genuine affection tempered by political necessity. The negotiation for a new empress becomes a contest between dynasties. Tsar Alexander offers his sister Anna Pavlovna, but Russian terms prove unacceptable. The Habsburgs, desperate to secure their survival, present a more tempting alternative: Archduchess Marie-Louise, 18 years old, daughter of Emperor Francis, great-niece of the martyred Marie Antoinette. The irony is exquisite. The daughter of Austria, that most implacable enemy of revolutionary France, will become the wife of the revolution's heir. In Vienna, courtiers who have spent decades cursing the Corsican upstart now practice the etiquette required to address him as cousin. In Paris, ministers who once demanded Habsburg blood now prepare to welcome a Habsburg princess as their empress. Marie-Louise herself, raised on stories of French brutality and revolutionary excess, approaches her destiny with the resignation of royal duty. Her portrait, painted by the court artist and sent to Napoleon, shows a young woman of conventional beauty: blonde hair, blue eyes, the pale complexion favored by Habsburg genetics. More importantly, her youth promises the fertility that Josephine could no longer provide. The marriage by proxy, conducted in Vienna's Augustinerkirche on March 11, 1810, marks the formal conclusion of centuries of Habsburg-Bourbon enmity. Archduke Charles, the same man who bled French armies at Aspern-Essling, stands as Napoleon's representative while his niece speaks vows that bind her to France's destiny. The ceremony possesses all the magnificence of Imperial Austria, but everyone present understands that real power now speaks with a Corsican accent. Marie-Louise's journey to France becomes a triumphal procession orchestrated by Napoleon's genius for spectacle. At every stop along the route from Vienna to Compiègne, French officials stage elaborate ceremonies. The new empress, traveling in a golden coach that once carried Habsburg empresses to their coronations, gradually transforms from Austrian archduchess to French consort. Her Viennese ladies-in-waiting give way to French attendants. Her German confessor yields to a French chaplain. Even her language gradually shifts from the German of her childhood to the French of her new subjects. Napoleon meets his bride at Compiègne, and their first encounter possesses all the awkwardness of arranged marriages between strangers. Marie-Louise, accustomed to the formal rituals of Austrian court life, finds herself embraced by a man whose informality would have scandalized her Habsburg relatives. Napoleon, expecting the sophisticated coquetry of Parisian society, discovers instead a sheltered girl whose knowledge of the world comes entirely from books and tutors. Yet the marriage works with surprising success. Marie-Louise, freed from the suffocating protocol of Vienna, discovers a world of possibility she never imagined. Napoleon, enchanted by her youth and genuine affection, finds in her the domestic happiness that political life has long denied him. Their correspondence, preserved in the archives of both France and Austria, reveals not passionate love but genuine companionship built on mutual respect and growing affection. The wedding ceremony at the Louvre on April 2, 1810, surpasses even Napoleon's coronation in its magnificence. The same chapel where French kings once married now witnesses the union of revolution and legitimacy. Marie-Louise, resplendent in a gown of white satin embroidered with silver thread, represents not just Austria but the old Europe that Napoleon has both conquered and co-opted. The political symbolism is overwhelming. Cardinals who once fled France during the Terror now bless this marriage. Princes of the Confederation of the Rhine attend as wedding guests rather than conquered enemies. The Tsar's ambassador presents congratulations from a monarch who once swore eternal enmity to revolutionary France. The reception that follows features delicacies from every corner of the empire: wines from the Rhine, oranges from Sicily, coffee from the Illyrian coast. But the marriage's true triumph comes not in ceremony but in biology. On March 20, 1811, cannon thunder across Paris announces the birth of Napoleon's son. The King of Rome, as the infant is immediately titled, ensures the dynasty's continuation and seemingly secures the empire's future. In the chapel of the Tuileries, the same priests who baptized the children of French kings now welcome the heir of the revolution into the Christian community. The birth transforms Napoleon's status in ways that military victory never could. European monarchs who dismissed him as an upstart adventurer must now acknowledge him as the founder of a legitimate dynasty. The child's Habsburg blood, flowing through Marie-Louise from centuries of imperial ancestry, provides the genetic credentials that Napoleon's own genius could never supply. In the nursery of the Tuileries, Napoleon plays with his son with the tenderness that few beyond his immediate family ever witness. The infant, swaddled in silk and lace, represents not just personal fulfillment but political vindication. The revolution, which began by destroying one monarchy, has created another. The Republic, which proclaimed the equality of man, has produced an emperor whose son will inherit the throne by divine right. The continental system, Napoleon's economic war against Britain, reaches its maximum extent during these peak years. From Hamburg to Rome, from Amsterdam to Dubrovnik, European ports close their doors to British trade. French customs officials patrol coastlines stretching from the North Sea to the Adriatic, enforcing decrees that aim to strangle British commerce and force London to acknowledge French supremacy. The system's effects ripple across global commerce. In Manchester, textile mills close for lack of continental markets. In Liverpool, merchant warehouses fill with goods that cannot reach their intended destinations. British gold flows to South America and India as London seeks new markets to replace European losses. The economic warfare that Napoleon wages proves as devastating as any military campaign. Yet the continental system's success creates unexpected consequences. French industry, protected from British competition, flourishes behind the economic barriers. Lyons silk manufacturers export their products across the empire without fear of Manchester's cheaper cottons. Lille's textile workers enjoy full employment serving markets from which British goods are excluded. The emperor's economic policies create a generation of French entrepreneurs whose prosperity depends on the empire's survival. In the salons of Paris, now the undisputed capital of continental Europe, society reaches heights of elegance unknown since Versailles. Marie-Louise, tutored by French courtiers in the arts of imperial entertaining, presides over receptions that attract diplomats, artists, and intellectuals from across the continent. Talleyrand, that master of diplomatic intrigue, organizes soirees where the future of nations is decided over champagne and conversation. The empire's cultural influence extends far beyond France's political borders. French becomes the language of European diplomacy, literature, and science. The University of France's graduates take positions in German universities, Italian academies, and Polish schools. French architectural styles influence construction from Barcelona to Berlin. Even the empire's enemies acknowledge the magnetism of French culture. Military colonies throughout the empire spread French influence through marriage and settlement. Veterans of Austerlitz and Jena retire to farms in the Rhineland, their French wives introducing continental customs to German villages. Italian officers trained in French military schools return home carrying ideas that transform local institutions. Polish nobles send their sons to Paris for education that opens doors throughout the empire. The administrative machine that Napoleon has created reaches peak efficiency during these years. From his office in the Tuileries, the emperor can communicate with prefects in Hamburg, judges in Rome, and generals in Croatia. The imperial postal system, protected by military escorts and standardized procedures, carries his will to the furthest corners of Europe. Weekly reports flow back to Paris, providing information about everything from grain harvests to public opinion. Yet, at the moment of greatest triumph, seeds of future disaster are already sprouting. The continental system, for all its economic success, depends on universal enforcement that grows increasingly difficult to maintain. Russia, Britain's traditional customer for timber and grain, chafes under restrictions that damage her economy without corresponding French concessions. Prussia, humiliated but not destroyed, uses the breathing space Napoleon has given her to rebuild her military power. In Spain, the ulcer that will drain French strength continues to fester. British gold and Portuguese bases keep resistance alive despite repeated French victories. Spanish guerrilla warfare, supported by Wellington's growing army, ties down 300,000 French troops who might otherwise guard the empire's eastern frontiers. Each village burned, each convoy attacked, Each French soldier killed in some anonymous Spanish ambush weakens the seemingly invincible imperial machine. But for now, in these golden months of 1810 and early 1811, such concerns seem distant. Napoleon stands astride Europe like a modern Caesar, his empire stretching from the Atlantic to the gates of Poland. His son sleeps peacefully in the Tuileries while his wife, daughter of emperors, learns to speak French with a Parisian accent. The Grande Armée camps in prosperity along the Rhine while French administrators govern territories that once sent armies against revolutionary France. The summit has been reached. The boy from Corsica has climbed higher than any man since Charlemagne. But summits, as mountaineers know, are precarious places. One false step, one moment of overconfidence, and the long fall begins. The candle burns lower still, its flame casting shadows that seem to dance with the ghosts of empires past and future. The Spanish catastrophe, 1808 to 1814. Spain became the ulcer that bled the empire to death, drop by precious drop. The morning of March 23, 1808 finds Napoleon in the Salon of the Grand Trianon, surrounded by maps of the Iberian Peninsula. The Spanish question, he believes, will be resolved with the same mathematical precision that solved the Austrian problem or the Prussian enigma. On paper, it seems simple enough: replace the incompetent Bourbon dynasty with his brother Joseph, modernize Spanish institutions along French lines, integrate Spain into the continental system. What could be simpler for the master of Europe? But Spain, as Napoleon will learn to his eternal cost, obeys different laws than the rest of Europe. This is not Prussia with its professional army and rational administration, nor Austria with its bureaucratic efficiency. Spain is a land where medieval fervor still burns beneath the surface of 18th-century politeness, where religious faith and regional pride create forces more powerful than any Grande Armée. The initial moves unfold with deceptive ease. King Charles IV and his son Ferdinand, caught in their pathetic family quarrel, are lured to Bayonne, where Napoleon treats them with the contemptuous dismissal reserved for puppets who have outlived their usefulness. The Bourbon dynasty that has ruled Spain since Philip V simply disappears, erased by imperial decree. Joseph Bonaparte, fresh from his success as King of Naples, receives a new crown and a new challenge. In Madrid, the French garrison under Murat maintains perfect discipline as the new order is proclaimed. The Spanish nobility, accustomed to centuries of foreign rule, first Austrian, then French Bourbon, seem ready to accept another foreign dynasty. The army, such as it is, offers no organized resistance. The Church, dependent on royal patronage, maintains cautious silence. On the surface, the conquest appears complete. But beneath the surface, in the narrow streets of Madrid's working quarters, in the taverns where craftsmen gather, in the markets where women sell their wares, a different mood prevails. These people, who have never read Voltaire or studied the rights of man, possess an instinctive understanding of what the French occupation means, the end of Spain as they have always known it. May 2, 1808. The explosion comes without warning. French soldiers, attempting to escort the last members of the royal family to exile, find their path blocked by crowds that seem to materialize from the very stones of Madrid. What begins as a demonstration becomes a riot. What starts as a riot becomes an insurrection. Spanish civilians, armed with nothing but kitchen knives and cobblestones, hurl themselves at French soldiers with the fury of religious martyrs. Murat's response is swift and merciless. Artillery, that ultimate argument of empires, speaks its brutal language in the streets of Madrid. Grape-shot tears through crowds like scythes through wheat. By evening, hundreds of Spanish civilians lie dead in the squares where they made their futile stand. The French casualties number barely a dozen. But something has changed, something that statistics cannot measure and artillery cannot silence. In the Prado, where Goya will later paint his immortal canvas of French soldiers executing Spanish patriots, a new kind of war is born. This is not the clean combat of professional armies meeting on chosen fields, but the savage struggle between an empire and a people, between the logic of conquest and the irrationality of faith. The uprising spreads like wildfire through the Spanish countryside. In Zaragoza, the citizens proclaim their defiance from cathedral towers, while French shells crash through medieval walls. In Seville, a junta declares itself the legitimate government of Spain and calls for aid from Britain, France's eternal enemy. In the Asturias, peasants who have never been beyond their valleys take up arms against the invaders who speak of liberation while bringing foreign rule. Napoleon, receiving reports in his study at Fontainebleau, cannot understand what he is reading. These are not the calculated moves of cabinet warfare but something primitive and elemental, a nation in spontaneous revolt. His marshals, summoned to explain the situation, can offer only the language they know. More troops, better artillery, systematic occupation. But how do you systematically occupy a people's soul? The arrival of British forces at Mondego Bay transforms local insurrection into international war. Sir Arthur Wellesley, the future Duke of Wellington, lands with 13,000 men and a treasury of British gold. He is not yet the master of battlefield tactics he will become, but he possesses something more valuable, an understanding of what this war might become if properly conducted. Wellesley's victory at Vimero, though small in scale, sends shockwaves through the French military hierarchy. For the first time since the Revolution began, a British army has defeated French forces in open battle. Junot, Napoleon's own student, watches his veterans retreat in disorder before red-coated infantry they had been taught to despise. The myth of French invincibility, already wounded at Osper-Nessling, suffers another grievous blow. But the real disaster unfolds not in the crash of artillery or the charge of cavalry, but in the shadows between battles. Spanish guerrilla warfare, that peculiar hybrid of banditry and patriotism, begins its deadly work. French couriers disappear on mountain roads. Supply convoys vanish into Spanish villages, their guards found days later with their throats cut. Isolated garrisons wake to find themselves surrounded by enemies who melt away like morning mist when regular troops approach. The word guerrilla, little war, enters the vocabulary of nations, but the reality proves anything but little. French soldiers, veterans of Austerlitz and Jena, discover that their tactical brilliance means nothing against an enemy who refuses to meet them in formal battle. Spanish fighters, armed with ancient muskets and rusty swords, wage war according to rules written not in military manuals but in the desperate mathematics of survival. Napoleon himself arrives in Spain in November 1808, bringing with him 200,000 men and the full weight of his military genius. His campaign unfolds with the precision that has made him master of Europe. Somosierra falls to a cavalry charge that becomes legendary. Madrid surrenders after token resistance. The Spanish armies, such as they are, dissolve before the imperial advance like snow before a flame. Yet even as Napoleon dictates bulletins celebrating his latest victories, he senses something different about this conquest. The Spanish nobles who attend his court in Madrid do so with the mechanical obedience of men who have no choice. The Spanish priests who bless his rule speak words their hearts reject. The Spanish people who line the streets to watch his parades maintain a silence more ominous than any hostile demonstration. The Peninsular War, as historians will name this conflict, settles into the pattern that will define it for 6 bloody years. French armies control the cities, the roads, the seats of government. But Spain, the Real Spain of villages and valleys, of local loyalties and ancient grudges, remains unconquered and perhaps unconquerable. From his headquarters in Salamanca, Wellington conducts his war with the patience of a master chess player. He understands what Napoleon's marshals cannot grasp, that this is not a war to be won by brilliant maneuvers or decisive battles, but a contest of endurance between systems. British sea power keeps him supplied while Spanish resistance keeps the French dispersed. Time, that ultimate weapon, fights on his side. The French armies in Spain, initially welcomed as liberators from Bourbon incompetence, gradually transform into an army of occupation facing a hostile population. Marshal Soult, governing Andalusia with the efficiency that has made him famous, discovers that efficient government means nothing when the governed regard you as foreign invaders. Suchet, perhaps the most competent of Napoleon's lieutenants, creates model administration in Aragon while fighting a daily battle against invisible enemies. The statistics tell the story that individual battles cannot convey. By 1810, Napoleon has 300,000 men in Spain, nearly half his total military strength tied down in a conflict that produces no decisive results. These are not raw recruits but veterans, men who have marched from Cadiz to Vienna, who have seen the inside of every European capital except London. Their absence from the eastern frontiers will prove catastrophic when new coalitions form. The Spanish Cortes, meeting in Cadiz while French armies occupy their capital, promulgate a constitution that will influence liberal movements across Europe. The irony is bitter. While Napoleon, the heir of the revolution, imposes foreign rule on Spain, Spanish patriots create institutions more revolutionary than anything France has produced since 1789. The Constitution of 1812, written in the shadow of French occupation, proclaims principles of popular sovereignty that will inspire Democrats for generations. French attempts to win Spanish hearts and minds founder on the rock of cultural incomprehension. Joseph Bonaparte, personally decent and administratively competent, issues decrees abolishing the Inquisition, modernizing education, reforming the tax system. These measures, welcomed by Spanish intellectuals, are regarded by Spanish peasants as attacks on their faith and traditions. The very improvements that should have won support instead confirm Spanish suspicions of French intentions. Religious resistance proves particularly intractable. Spanish priests, preaching from pulpits in occupied cities, transform every Sunday service into an act of defiance. The Virgin of Pilar becomes a rallying point for Zaragoza's defenders. Santiago Matamoros St. James the Moorslayer is invoked against new infidels from across the Pyrenees. Faith and patriotism fuse into a compound more explosive than gunpowder. The atrocities multiply on both sides with the inevitability of escalation. French soldiers, frustrated by an enemy they cannot see or catch, exact terrible revenge on civilian populations. Spanish guerrillas, operating outside the conventions of civilized warfare, show no mercy to captured French troops. Goya's Disasters of War, etched with the acid of personal witness, captures the degradation that war visits upon both conqueror and conquered. By 1812, even Napoleon acknowledges the Spanish disaster. From his headquarters in Moscow, he writes to Joseph, "The Spanish affair is killing me. It absorbs all my attention and all my forces. The man who redesigned the map of Europe cannot solve the riddle of Spanish resistance. Every tactical victory breeds strategic defeat. Every occupied city becomes a hostage to guerrilla retribution." Wellington, meanwhile, has evolved from cautious defensive fighter to master of offensive warfare. His victory at Salamanca in 1812, executed with the precision of a surgical operation, destroys an entire French army and opens the road to Madrid. For the first time, a British general has outmaneuvered French marshals on their own terms. The psychological impact reverberates across Europe. If the French can be beaten in Spain, they can be beaten elsewhere. The withdrawal from Madrid becomes a symbol of French decline. Joseph Bonaparte, who entered his capital as a conqueror in 1808, flees as a refugee in 1813. The royal baggage train, loaded with Spanish treasures looted during 5 years of occupation, stretches for miles through the passes of the Sierra de Guadarrama. Spanish guerrillas, scenting victory at last, harass the retreat with the pitiless efficiency of wolves following wounded prey. At Vitoria, Wellington inflicts the final humiliation on French arms in Spain. The battle itself, though tactically impressive, matters less than its aftermath. The entire French baggage train, containing not only military supplies but also the accumulated plunder of years of occupation, falls into British hands. King Joseph's personal effects, including his collection of stolen Spanish paintings, become trophies in British country houses. The French evacuation of Spain coincides with the disasters befalling Napoleon's main armies in Germany. Troops desperately needed to defend the Rhine remain tied down in Spanish garrisons. Veterans who might have turned the tide at Leipzig die in unnamed Spanish villages, victims of a war that never should have been fought. Soult's final campaigns in southern France, fighting with his back to the Pyrenees, demonstrate the marshal's tactical brilliance while confirming the strategic hopelessness of France's position. Wellington, now a duke and a European celebrity, presses his advantage with the methodical persistence that has made him Napoleon's most dangerous enemy. The man who learned his trade fighting Tipu Sultan in India now applies those lessons to the destruction of the French Empire. The Spanish War's true cost cannot be measured in casualties or treasure, though both are enormous. Spain costs Napoleon something more precious: time. The 6 years spent attempting to digest the Spanish acquisition are 6 years during which his other enemies rebuild their strength. The 300,000 men wasted in Spanish garrisons are 300,000 men absent from the decisive campaigns in Germany and Russia. More subtly, Spain demonstrates that Napoleon's system has limits. The master of Europe, who has bent every other nation to his will, cannot break the stubborn resistance of Spanish peasants fighting for their villages and their faith. The lesson resonates across the continent: if Spain can resist, others might resist as well. The guerrilla warfare pioneered in Spanish mountains will inspire resistance movements from Russia to Germany. The tactics developed by Spanish fighters, ambush, assassination, the systematic harassment of occupying forces, will be studied and imitated by patriots who refuse to accept foreign rule. Spain, intended as a demonstration of French power, becomes instead a school for French opponents. In the end, Spain teaches Napoleon the hardest lesson of his career: that there are victories too expensive to achieve, conquests too costly to maintain. The Spanish crown, which seemed such a glittering prize in 1808, becomes a crown of thorns that bleeds the empire white. The ulcer that began with a riot in Madrid spreads its poison through the imperial system until even Napoleon's genius cannot heal the wound. The last French soldiers crossed the Pyrenees in defeat, their eagles furled, their pride broken by 6 years of humiliation. Behind them, they leave a Spain exhausted by war but exhilarated by victory. The Spanish resistance has achieved what no coalition of professional armies could accomplish. They have proven that Napoleon can be beaten, that his empire can bleed, that his power has limits. The boy from Corsica, master of battlefields from Egypt to Austria, has learned a truth that generals throughout history have discovered to their cost: that conquering a country and conquering a people are entirely different propositions. The candle flame flickers more urgently now, as if disturbed by winds blowing from distant battlefields where empires struggle and die. 6. The Russian campaign, 1812. 600,000 men marched east. Winter brought them home. The river Niemen flows quietly through the Lithuanian countryside on the night of June 23, 1812, its waters reflecting the campfires of the greatest army the world has ever seen. Along its western bank, stretching as far as the eye can reach, lies the Grande Armée in all its terrible magnificence. 600,000 men drawn from every corner of Europe, French veterans of Austerlitz and Wagram, German professionals from the Confederation of the Rhine, Polish lancers dreaming of restored independence, Italian grenadiers bronzed by Mediterranean sun. Napoleon stands on a small hill overlooking the river, wrapped in his familiar gray coat, his face illuminated by the flickering light of torches. At 43, he has reached the summit of human ambition. Behind him stretches an empire from the Atlantic to the Oder. Before him lies Russia, that last great obstacle to continental hegemony. Tomorrow, this vast host will cross the Niemen and march toward Moscow, toward destiny, toward catastrophe. The emperor's reasons for this colossal gamble are complex as they are compelling. Tsar Alexander I, that Sphinx of the North, has grown increasingly unreliable since Tilsit. Russian merchants chafe under the continental system's restrictions. Russian wheat and timber flow to Britain despite imperial prohibitions. Russian diplomats whisper encouragement to Austria and Prussia. The alliance that once divided Europe between two emperors has become a facade concealing mutual suspicion and growing hostility. But deeper than politics lies Napoleon's own psychological necessity. He has conquered every enemy except time itself. At 43, he senses mortality approaching. The seizures that occasionally grip him in moments of stress remind him that even emperors are mortal. Russia represents not just political necessity but the completion of his historical mission, the unification of Europe under French leadership. The crossing begins at dawn with all the pageantry Napoleon can command. Bands play the Marseillaise, while eagles gleam in the morning sunlight. The emperor himself leads the advance guard, his horses' hooves the first to touch Russian soil. Behind him, In columns that stretch beyond the horizon, marches the polyglot host that represents the demographic and economic resources of continental Europe. Yet even in this moment of apparent triumph, careful observers might note troubling signs. The army's size, its greatest strength, creates logistical problems that no military force has ever faced. The supply trains stretch for hundreds of miles, vulnerable to weather, terrain, and enemy action. The diverse nationalities that give the army its grandeur also create communication difficulties and divided loyalties. Most ominously, the Russians offer no battle, no opportunity for the swift, decisive victory that has characterized all Napoleon's previous campaigns. Alexander I, that most enigmatic of Napoleon's opponents, has chosen his strategy with diabolic cunning. The Russian armies, under Barclay de Tolly and Bagration, retreat steadily eastward, drawing the invaders deeper into the vastness of their homeland. Cities are evacuated, supplies destroyed, wells poisoned. The scorched earth policy, implemented with ruthless efficiency, transforms the Grande Armée's advance into a nightmare of logistics and morale. By July, the first casualties begin to mount, though not from enemy action. Disease, that ancient killer of armies, stalks the French columns with remorseless efficiency. Typhus spreads through the ranks like wildfire. Dysentery weakens men already exhausted by the brutal pace of the advance. The primitive sanitation of early 19th century armies, adequate for normal campaigns, proves catastrophically insufficient for an enterprise of this magnitude. Napoleon, riding at the head of his guard, maintains outward confidence while privately calculating the growing cost of each day's march. His daily reports to Paris speak of inevitable victory, but his private correspondence reveals mounting concern. "The weather is very hot," he writes to Marie-Louise. "The country is very poor. I have been constantly on horseback. I am very well, but a little thin." Smolensk, that ancient fortress city guarding the approaches to Moscow, finally offers the prospect of decisive battle. The Russian armies, reinforced and resupplied, seem prepared to make their stand behind medieval walls that have withstood Polish kings and Swedish conquerors. Napoleon, his strategic instincts sharpened by 20 years of warfare, masses his artillery for the assault that will crack Russian resistance and open the road to their capital. The bombardment of Smolensk possesses a biblical fury. French guns, the finest in Europe, tear gaps in walls that have stood for centuries. Russian defenders, fighting with the desperation of men protecting their homeland, contest every breach, every street, every building. When the city finally falls, it burns for 3 days, its flames visible from dozens of miles away. The Russians retreat once more, leaving behind only ashes and the corpses of their countrymen. But Smolensk's capture costs Napoleon something precious time. Each day spent reducing the fortress is another day for winter to approach, another day for Russian reinforcements to arrive, another day for his own strength to diminish. His marshals, veterans of a dozen campaigns, begin to voice the doubts they have never before expressed. Murat, splendid in his theatrical uniforms, speaks of the army's growing exhaustion. Nay, bravest of the brave, reports concerning casualty figures from his own corps. The Russian army's retreat continues with maddening consistency. Kutuzov, that ancient fox of the steppes, has replaced Barclay de Tolly as supreme commander, but the strategy remains unchanged: trade space for time, distance for strength, Russian lives for French endurance. Every mile deeper into Russia carries Napoleon further from his bases, his reinforcements, his lines of retreat. August passes in a blur of forced marches and empty victories. Russian cities open their gates to French occupation and close them again after French departure. The countryside, vast as an ocean and nearly as empty, swallows the Grande Armée like water absorbs a thrown stone. Supply convoys, strung out across hundreds of miles of primitive roads, become targets for Cossack raids that appear from nowhere and vanish like ghosts. The horses begin dying first. These magnificent creatures, bred in the stables of Europe's finest regiments, cannot endure the combination of inadequate forage and brutal marching. French cuirassiers, pride of the imperial cavalry, find themselves dismounted and struggling forward on foot. Artillery pieces, deprived of draft animals, are abandoned along roadsides that stretch toward infinity. Napoleon's correspondence with Paris takes on an increasingly desperate tone. He demands reinforcements, supplies, political support, but the distances involved make meaningful assistance impossible. Letters that take weeks to reach their destination return answers that address situations long since changed. The emperor, accustomed to personal control over every aspect of his campaigns, discovers the bitter limitations of commanding at such extended range. September 7, 1812. At last, on the rolling fields before the village of Borodino, Kutuzov turns to fight. The Russian position, carefully chosen and systematically fortified, blocks the road to Moscow like a door of steel. 120,000 Russians, fighting for their homes and their faith, prepare to meet 130,000 invaders in what will become the bloodiest single day of the Napoleonic Wars. The Battle of Borodino unfolds with the mechanical precision of a slaughterhouse. French artillery, massed in grand batteries that speak with the voice of thunder, tears gaps in Russian lines that close again like water. Russian defenders, standing firm in squares and columns, die where they stand rather than yield ground they have sworn to defend. The great redoubt, centerpiece of Kutuzov's position, changes hands repeatedly as attack follows counterattack in cycles of death. Napoleon, suffering from a bout of illness that leaves him sluggish and indecisive, watches the carnage from his command post with growing unease. This is not the swift, surgical victory that has characterized his previous battles. Russian resistance, far from cracking under pressure, seems to harden with each assault. By noon, French casualties mount to levels that would have ended most 18th-century battles. Yet the fighting continues with undiminished fury. Ney, his uniform torn by bullets, his face blackened by powder smoke, leads charge after charge against positions that seem impregnable. Murat, magnificent even in defeat, rallies broken cavalry regiments for attacks that accomplish nothing except to add more names to the casualty rolls. Davout, wounded but refusing to leave the field, continues to feed his infantry into the meat grinder of Russian resistance. By evening, technical victory belongs to the French. Russian forces, having lost perhaps 45,000 men, withdraw from positions they can no longer hold. But Napoleon's casualties, 35,000 of his finest soldiers, represent losses he cannot replace. The Grande Armée, bled white in a single day's fighting, has won the field while losing the campaign. Moscow lies ahead, that golden-domed prize that has lured Napoleon across half of Europe. On September 14th, French cavalry patrols report the city's ancient walls gleaming in the afternoon sunlight. The capital of the Tsars, seat of Orthodox Christianity, heart of Russian civilization, awaits its conqueror with the silence of abandonment. The occupation of Moscow becomes a hollow triumph that tastes of ashes in Napoleon's mouth. The city, evacuated by its population and stripped of supplies, offers no sustenance for his starving army. Worse, fires break out on the night of his arrival. Whether set by Russian patriots or ignited by French foraging parties remains unclear. For 3 days, Moscow burns while Napoleon watches from the Kremlin's windows. In the Tsar's own apartments, Napoleon dictates letters to Alexander that oscillate between threats and entreaties. He offers peace, threatens destruction, promises reconciliation, hints at further conquest. But his messages disappear into the Russian vastness without reply. Alexander, safe in St. Petersburg, understands what Napoleon apparently cannot grasp, that time fights on Russia's side with every passing day. October arrives with the first hint of winter's approach. Still no word from Alexander. Still no sign of Russian submission. The Grande Armée, camped in and around Moscow, slowly consumes itself through indiscipline and inaction. Soldiers who once stood in perfect formation at Austerlitz now wander through Russian streets like bandits. Officers who once prided themselves on professional competence struggle to maintain even basic military organization. The decision to retreat comes almost too late. Napoleon, finally acknowledging the impossibility of his position, orders the evacuation of Moscow on October 19th. But the delay has cost him everything. October in Russia carries winter's promise, and the Grande Armée, weakened by 3 months of attrition, faces the prospect of a winter retreat across the same devastated countryside it traversed in summer's heat. The retreat begins as an organized withdrawal but degenerates into chaos with frightening speed. The same roads that slowed Napoleon's advance become death traps for his retreat. Russian cavalry, reinforced and resupplied, harass the French columns with the persistence of wolves following wounded prey. Cossacks, those masters of irregular warfare, appear from nowhere to strike at stragglers and supply trains. At Maloyaroslavets, Kutuzov makes one final attempt to destroy the retreating army in battle. The engagement, smaller than Borodino but no less vicious, demonstrates that the Grande Armée retains enough fighting spirit to defeat Russian regulars. But tactical victory cannot solve strategic impossibility. The French must continue their retreat, and with each mile westward, their situation grows more desperate. November brings the first snows, and with them, the death of Napoleon's dreams. The thermometer plunges below freezing and continues its relentless descent. Soldiers accustomed to Mediterranean sunshine and German warmth discover the meaning of Russian winter. Feet freeze in boots never designed for such cold. Hands, numb with frost, cannot grip weapons or reins. Men fall in the snow and do not rise again. The horses die first, as they did in summer, but now their death means something different. Without cavalry, the army cannot scout or screen its movements. Without draft animals, the artillery must be abandoned. The magnificent 12-pounders that battered the walls of Smolensk are spiked and left beside roads that lead nowhere but deeper into catastrophe. Discipline evaporates like breath on winter air. Regiments that once marched in perfect step now straggle across the frozen landscape in loose groups held together only by mutual desperation. The Imperial Guard, pride of the army and symbol of French military excellence, maintains better order than the line troops, but cannot escape the universal demoralization. At Krasno, Napoleon makes his last attempt to preserve his army's fighting capacity. Russian forces, moving parallel to the French retreat, threaten to cut off the line of withdrawal. For 3 days, individual corps fight desperate rearguard actions while the emperor struggles to coordinate a defense with forces that barely qualify as military units. Ney, commanding the rearguard with his characteristic courage, holds off Russian attacks that could annihilate the entire retreat. His soldiers, reduced to perhaps 3,000 men from the 40,000 who crossed the Niemen, fight with the desperation of cornered animals. When ammunition runs out, they use bayonets. When bayonets break, they use bare hands. The bravest of the brave earns his nickname in the snows of Russia. The Berezina crossing becomes the final test of the Grande Armée's endurance. The river, swollen by autumn rains and clogged with ice, presents an obstacle that seems designed by Providence to complete France's destruction. Russian forces, converging from multiple directions, prepare to trap Napoleon's remaining forces against the water barrier. But Napoleon, even in defeat, demonstrates flashes of the genius that conquered Europe. His engineers, working waist-deep in icy water that kills men in minutes, construct bridges that should be impossible under such conditions. His soldiers, summoning reserves of courage they did not know they possessed, hold bridgeheads against overwhelming odds. The crossing succeeds, but at a cost that transforms victory into catastrophe. Thousands die in the crushing panic as desperate men fight for places on bridges that sway under impossible loads. The river ice, stained red with French blood, carries away the dreams of empire along with the bodies of men who once dreamed of glory. By December, the retreat has become the rout of dissolution. Napoleon, facing the prospect of capture or death in Russian snows, makes the hardest decision of his life. On December 5th, he abandons his army and races toward Paris in a sleigh, accompanied only by a handful of companions. Behind him, he leaves the wreckage of the greatest military force in history. Murat, assuming command of what remains, leads perhaps 20,000 organized soldiers across the Niemen in December, the sole remnants of the 600,000 who crossed it in June. The rest lie buried in Russian soil or wander as prisoners through Siberian wastes. The Grande Armée, instrument of European conquest, exists no more. The 29th Bulletin, Napoleon's final communiqué from Russia, acknowledges disaster with characteristic understatement. The army has suffered somewhat from the rigors of the season, but the euphemism cannot disguise the magnitude of the catastrophe. France has lost not just an army but a generation of young men. The empire has suffered a wound from which it will never recover. In the smoking ruins of Moscow, in the frozen hell of the retreat, on the blood-stained ice of the Berezina, Napoleon learned the lesson that has destroyed conquerors from Darius to Hitler, that Russia's greatest weapon is not her armies but her vastness, not her generals but her winter, not her strategy but her willingness to sacrifice everything for survival. The boy from Corsica, who once boasted that he made his own destiny, discovered in the Russian snows that some forces transcend human will. The emperor who had redrawn the map of Europe found that geography itself could be his enemy. The genius who had never known defeat learned that even genius has limits when confronted with infinity. The candle gutters lower, its flames struggling against invisible drafts that seem to carry the whispers of dying men and the silence of Russian snows. 7. Battles against the Sixth Coalition, 1813 to 1814. Genius burned brightest in its final hour, but even stars must fall. The winter of 1812 to 1813 finds Napoleon in the Tuileries, surrounded by the splendor of empire but haunted by the ghosts of 400,000 dead. Outside his windows, Paris maintains its elegant facade, but behind closed doors, whispers circulate like poison through the corridors of power. The Russian disaster has shattered more than an army. It has broken the myth of French invincibility that held Europe in thrall for a decade. In the map room where he once planned the conquest of the world, Napoleon spreads the charts of Germany with hands that tremble slightly, whether from illness, exhaustion, or the weight of impending catastrophe. Even he cannot say. The strategic situation confronting him would daunt a lesser man into immediate capitulation. Russia, far from being crippled by her own losses, burns with the fervor of righteous vengeance. Prussia, that humiliated kingdom he thought forever broken, stirs with dreams of resurrection. Austria, his father-in-law's empire, calculates the odds with Habsburg cunning. But most ominously, the German people themselves, those subjects of a dozen petty princes who had accepted French rule with sullen resignation, begin to speak in whispers of liberation. The word nationalism, barely understood a generation ago, spreads through German universities and beer halls like wildfire. Students who once studied French philosophy now sing patriotic songs. Professors who once praised the civil code now lecture on German destiny. Napoleon's response to this existential crisis reveals both his greatness and his limitations. Where other men might seek compromise or accommodation, he chooses the path that has always served him: audacious offensive action. If Europe wants war, he will give them war on a scale that will dwarf all previous conflicts. From the administrative machinery of the empire, still functioning with mechanical efficiency despite the Russian catastrophe, he conjures a new army. The conscription of 1813 sweeps through France like a harvester through wheat fields. Boys of 18 who should be learning trades find themselves drilling with muskets. Men of 40 who thought their military service long finished receive summons to the colors. The National Guard, intended for purely defensive purposes, provides cadres for new regiments. Even the Customs Service and the Gendarmerie contribute personnel to fill the gaps torn by Russian winter. By April 1813, Napoleon has accomplished what his enemies thought impossible: the creation of a field army numbering 200,000 men. These are not the grizzled veterans of Austerlitz and Jena, men who had learned their trade in a dozen campaigns. These are boys and old men, hastily trained and inadequately equipped, their courage untested and their loyalty uncertain. But they are French, and their emperor's genius for inspiring ordinary men to extraordinary deeds has not deserted him. The spring campaign opens with a brilliance that recalls Napoleon's greatest triumphs. At Lutzen, that field where Gustavus Adolphus died nearly 2 centuries earlier, the emperor demonstrates that tactical genius can compensate for strategic weakness. Russian and Prussian forces, confident in their numerical superiority and moral ascendancy, find themselves outmaneuvered by an opponent they had presumed defeated. The battle unfolds with the mathematical precision that has characterized all Napoleon's victories. French columns, advancing through morning mist, strike the Allied army at the moment of maximum vulnerability. Russian squares, disciplined products of European military tradition, dissolve under the impact of French bayonet charges led by boys young enough to be their sons. Prussian cavalry, heir to Frederick the Great's tactical legacy, recoils before French horsemen mounted on requisitioned farm horses. Yet victory at Lutzen tastes bitter in Napoleon's mouth. His losses, though lighter than those of his enemies, represent men he cannot replace. More critically, the absence of adequate cavalry, most of his horses died in Russia, prevents the pursuit that might have transformed tactical success into strategic triumph. The Allies retreat in good order, bloodied but not broken, learning lessons that will serve them well in future encounters. Bautzen, fought 3 weeks later, repeats the pattern with maddening consistency. Napoleon's tactical brilliance produces another French victory. Allied casualties exceed French losses by a comfortable margin. But again, the emperor cannot exploit his success. His young soldiers, brave enough in battle, lack the stamina for the forced marches that once carried French armies to decisive triumph. His artillery, served by enthusiastic amateurs rather than professional gunners, inflicts damage but cannot deliver the crushing blows that once shattered enemy morale. The Armistice of Plaswitz, agreed upon in June 1813, provides both sides with breathing space but ultimately favors the coalition. Napoleon, always at his best when acting with lightning speed, finds himself trapped in negotiations that drag on through the summer months. Each day of delay brings fresh reinforcements to his enemies while his own resources dwindle. Austria, the great prize that might tip the balance, edges closer to open hostility with each passing week. Metternich, that master of diplomatic chess, conducts the negotiations with Austria's traditional cunning. In the gardens of the Marcolini Palace in Dresden, he meets with Napoleon in conversations that will determine the fate of Europe. The Austrian minister, elegant in his diplomatic uniform, speaks of peace while calculating the terms of war. Napoleon, his face drawn with exhaustion and illness, alternates between threats and entreaties in a desperate attempt to preserve his crumbling empire. "Your Majesty," Metternich observes with cold precision, "you are a man lost." The words hang between them like a sword, and Napoleon's response, a mixture of fury and desperation, reveals how far the mighty have fallen. The man who once dismissed emperors with a gesture now pleads with their ministers for understanding. The resumption of hostilities in August finds Napoleon facing odds that would have seemed fantastic even a year earlier. The Sixth Coalition has mobilized the resources of half the world against him. British gold flows like water to subsidize armies from the Baltic to the Mediterranean. Russian manpower, seemingly inexhaustible, provides the coalition with reserves that dwarf anything France can muster. Prussian enthusiasm, channeled by military reformers like Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, creates a people's army animated by patriotic fervor. Most dangerously, Austria's entry into the coalition in August brings not just another enemy but a strategic genius equal to Napoleon himself. Schwarzenberg, the Austrian commander-in-chief, understands what previous coalition commanders could never grasp, that Napoleon's greatest weapon is the enemy's eagerness to fight him. The Austrian strategy, refined through bitter experience, aims to avoid battle with Napoleon personally while wearing down his subordinates through constant pressure. The summer campaign of 1813 becomes a deadly game of cat and mouse played across the German landscape. 3 Allied armies, Schwarzenberg's Austrians in the south, Blücher's Prussians in the north, Bernadotte's Swedes in the northeast, converge on Napoleon's positions like the closing jaws of a vice. Each time the emperor moves to strike one enemy, the others threaten his communications or his flanks. At Dresden, Napoleon achieves his last great tactical triumph. The battle, fought in the shadow of the Saxon capital's Baroque churches, sees French arms prevail once more through superior leadership and coordinated tactics. Allied casualties mount to levels reminiscent of Austerlitz while French losses remain manageable. For a moment, the old magic seems to work. European armies flee before the Imperial Eagles as they have so many times before. But Dresden's aftermath reveals the fundamental weakness of Napoleon's strategic position. His marshals, commanding independent operations, lack both the experience and the tactical flexibility to exploit opportunities or avoid disasters. Van Damme, pursuing the retreating Austrians, allows himself to be surrounded and captured at Kulm. Oudinot's advance on Berlin ends in defeat at Grossbeeren. MacDonald's offensive against Blücher collapses at the Katzbach. Each subordinate defeat chips away at French strength like water wearing down stone. Napoleon, for all his genius, cannot be everywhere at once. The empire that once benefited from unified command now suffers from the impossibility of central control over multiple simultaneous campaigns. His marshals, brave men all, prove inadequate substitutes for their emperor's personal presence. October 1813 brings the coalition armies together for the climactic struggle that will determine Europe's fate. At Leipzig, that crossroads of German commerce where trade routes from every direction converge, the largest battle in European history unfolds over 4 days of unprecedented carnage. 500,000 men, more than the population of most contemporary cities, gather to settle accounts written in blood across 20 years of warfare. The Battle of Leipzig, soon to be known as the Battle of the Nations, pits Napoleon's 185,000 French and Allied troops against 365,000 coalition soldiers representing every major European power. The arithmetic alone suggests French defeat, but Napoleon has overcome worse odds through tactical brilliance and superior leadership. If he can defeat the Allied armies in detail before they achieve effective coordination, victory remains possible. The first day's fighting demonstrates both Napoleon's continued tactical mastery and the coalition's improved competence. French attacks, launched with the precision that has made Napoleon's reputation, achieve local successes but cannot break the Allied line. Coalition counterattacks, better coordinated than in previous campaigns, force French withdrawals but cannot achieve decisive breakthrough. By evening, both sides have bloodied each other without achieving strategic advantage. The second day brings the defection that Napoleon has long dreaded but somehow failed to prevent. The Saxon Corps, fighting for their homeland but under French command, turns its guns on their erstwhile allies and marches toward the coalition lines. The betrayal, though involving relatively few troops, sends shockwaves through the French army that far exceed its tactical significance. Napoleon, watching from his command post as Saxon soldiers desert to his enemies, experiences perhaps the bitterest moment of his military career. These are not reluctant conscripts or foreign mercenaries but German allies who had fought beside French troops for years. Their defection symbolizes the collapse of the entire system he has built, the network of alliances and dependencies that once made him master of Europe. The third day witnesses French resistance gradually crumbling under the weight of overwhelming numbers. Napoleon's young soldiers, fighting with desperate courage, cannot compensate for their lack of experience or equipment. French artillery, served by boys who learned their trade in weeks rather than years, duels with coalition guns manned by veterans of multiple campaigns. The mathematics of attrition work inexorably against French hopes. By the fourth day, retreat becomes the only option for avoiding complete annihilation. Napoleon, his army reduced to perhaps 80,000 effectives, conducts a fighting withdrawal toward the Rhine that demonstrates his tactical genius even in defeat. French rearguards, sacrificing themselves with magnificent futility, buy time for the main army to escape encirclement. The emperor himself, his face aged a decade in 4 days, leads his broken forces westward toward a France that may no longer exist. The retreat from Leipzig becomes a rout as German populations, inflamed by years of French occupation, exact terrible revenge on their former masters. French stragglers, caught by German irregulars, die in village squares where they once collected taxes for the empire. Supply convoys, attacked by peasants armed with pitchforks and hunting rifles, disappear into the German countryside. The vengeance visited upon French forces provides a bitter preview of what awaits Napoleon's empire as it contracts toward its original borders. The collapse of the Confederation of the Rhine follows with mathematical inevitability. German princes, who accepted French protection when it seemed permanent, hastily change sides as coalition armies approach their capitals. The Kingdom of Westphalia dissolves overnight. The Grand Duchy of Berg evaporates like morning mist. Bavaria, Napoleon's most faithful German ally, negotiates its defection with indecent haste. By December 1813, French forces have retreated across the Rhine for the first time since the Revolution began. The natural frontier that French armies crossed in triumph 20 years earlier now becomes a barrier protecting France itself from invasion. Napoleon, surveying the wreckage of his European empire from headquarters in Mainz, faces the prospect that would have seemed impossible even 6 months earlier: foreign armies marching on Paris. The invasion of France, launched by the coalition in January 1814, presents Napoleon with both his greatest challenge and his final opportunity. For the first time since the early days of the Revolution, France herself faces foreign occupation. The patriotic fervor that once carried French armies to victory throughout Europe now burns on French soil, animated by the defense of hearth and home. Napoleon's response to invasion demonstrates that genius undimmed by disaster. With perhaps 70,000 men, a fraction of the forces he once commanded, he launches a campaign that ranks among the most brilliant in military history. The 6 Days Campaign, fought in the Champagne country east of Paris, sees the emperor defeat coalition forces nearly 3 times his strength through pure tactical excellence. At Champaubert, French forces surprise a Russian corps and destroy it in detail. At Montmirail, Prussian troops advancing in confident expectation of easy victory find themselves shattered by concentrated French attacks. At Château-Thierry, Napoleon demonstrates once more his mastery of interior lines and concentrated force. Each victory, though small in scale, sends shockwaves through coalition ranks as commanders remember why they feared this man. But tactical brilliance cannot overcome strategic impossibility. For every coalition force Napoleon defeats, 2 more cross the frontier. His victories, though spectacular, cost him men he cannot replace while inflicting losses his enemies can easily absorb. Paris itself, denuded of defenders, lies open to attack by any coalition force that bypasses the emperor's small army. The defense of Paris becomes a tragedy worthy of ancient drama. Marie-Louise, Napoleon's Habsburg empress, flees toward safety with their 3-year-old son. The city that has known only victory parades for a generation prepares for siege by foreign armies. Citizens who cheered French conquests from Egypt to Austria now huddle in their homes while enemy artillery positions itself on Montmartre's heights. Joseph Bonaparte, Napoleon's brother and former king of Spain, attempts to organize resistance with resources that would have seemed laughable in the empire's glory days. The National Guard, composed largely of teenagers and old men, mans barricades erected in streets where Napoleon once celebrated his triumphs. Military students from the École Militaire, boys who dreamed of following their emperor to glory, prepare to die defending their capital. The surrender of Paris on March 31, 1814, marks the end of an epoch. Tsar Alexander I, riding through streets where French emperors once held court, experiences the sweetest revenge known to mankind, the complete reversal of fortune between victor and vanquished. Prussian troops, remembering their humiliation after Jena, march past the Arc de Triomphe erected to celebrate their defeat. Austrian soldiers, whose empire once trembled before French power, occupy palaces where Habsburg princesses had been forced to marry French upstarts. Napoleon, racing toward his capital with the few thousand men remaining to him, arrives too late to affect the outcome. At Fontainebleau, in the same palace where he once entertained European royalty as supplicants, he faces the ultimatum that ends 25 years of revolutionary warfare: abdicate unconditionally, or watch France herself disappear beneath the weight of foreign occupation. The act of abdication, signed on April 4, 1814, represents more than the fall of one man or even one dynasty. With Napoleon's signature, the great revolutionary experiment that began with the storming of the Bastille finally exhausts itself. The ideals that carried French armies across Europe, liberty, equality, fraternity, yield to the older imperatives of dynasty, legitimacy, and balance of power. The farewell to the Guard at Fontainebleau provides the final scene of this imperial tragedy. Napoleon, standing before the men who have followed him from the pyramids to Moscow, speaks words that echo through history. "Soldiers of my old guard, I bid you farewell. For 20 years I have constantly accompanied you on the road to honor and glory. With men such as you, our cause could not be lost, but the war would have been interminable. The tears streaming down the faces of grizzled veterans who have never wept in battle testify to the bond between Napoleon and his soldiers. These men, who have conquered Europe in his name, now watch him board the carriage that will carry him to exile on Elba. The eagles that once soared from Madrid to Moscow fold their wings. The Grande Armée, instrument of French hegemony, exists no more. Yet even in defeat, Napoleon has demonstrated something that his enemies can neither understand nor emulate. For 4 months, with resources that seemed hopelessly inadequate, he fought all of Europe to a standstill. His campaign of 1814, though ultimately unsuccessful, ranks among the most brilliant examples of military leadership in history. Genius, it seems, burns brightest in its final hour. The boy from Corsica, who once boasted that impossible was not a French word, learned in the snows of Russia and the fields of Germany that even French genius has limits. But in his final campaigns, fighting for a cause already lost, he proved that those limits extend far beyond what ordinary mortals can achieve. The candle flame wavers desperately now, casting dancing shadows that seem to perform a funeral dance for fallen empires and broken dreams. 8. The 100 Days and Waterloo, 1815. He escaped from his island prison to die on a Belgian field. The eagles flew once more, but sunset was coming. The island of Elba sits in the Mediterranean like a forgotten jewel, its rocky shores kissed by the same ancient waters that once carried Roman galleys and Carthaginian merchantmen. On this insignificant speck of land, barely 10 miles long and 4 miles wide, the master of Europe spends his exile counting fishing boats and reviewing a guard of 600 men. Napoleon Bonaparte, Emperor of the French, King of Italy, Protector of the Confederation of the Rhine, now rules 12,000 subjects on an island that wouldn't qualify as a respectable suburb of Paris. The Villa San Martino, his modest residence overlooking Portoferrao harbor, bears little resemblance to the palaces where he once entertained the kings of Europe. Here, in rooms barely larger than those he occupied as a young officer, Napoleon paces through the long Mediterranean nights, his mind turning over possibilities like a chess master studying an impossible position. Through his windows, he can see the French coast on clear days France, calling to him across the water like a lover's whisper. The reports that reach him through secret correspondence paint a picture of universal discontent. Louis XVIII, restored to his ancestors' throne by foreign bayonets, proves as ineffectual as the Bourbons' reputation suggests. The old nobility, returning from emigration with claims for confiscated property, alienates the bourgeoisie who bought those same properties during the Revolution. The army, reduced to a fraction of its former size and officered by returned émigrés, seethes with wounded pride and frustrated patriotism. More encouraging still, the Congress of Vienna has revealed the coalition's fundamental weakness: success. With Napoleon safely confined to his island, the great powers discover that they have little in common except their former enemy. Austria and Russia quarrel over Poland. Britain and France dispute colonial boundaries. Prussia demands territories that other powers refuse to grant. The unity forged by shared fear dissolves in the acid of competing interests. By February 1815, Napoleon has made his decision. In the cottage that serves as his palace, surrounded by the handful of faithful followers who chose exile over accommodation with the Bourbons, he plans the most audacious gamble of his extraordinary career. With 1,000 men and 7 ships, he will reconquer an empire, reclaim a throne, and restore a dynasty. The very impossibility of the enterprise appeals to his romantic sense of destiny. The Escape from Elba, launched on February 26th, possesses all the theatrical drama Napoleon has always loved. The brig Inconstant, loaded with his tiny army and what remains of his imperial treasure, slips out of Portoferrao harbor under cover of darkness. British warships patrol these waters, Austrian agents watch every port, yet the Emperor of the French sails toward France as audaciously as if he commanded the combined fleets of Europe. The landing at Golfe-Juan on March 1st marks the beginning of the most extraordinary political resurrection in European history. Napoleon, stepping onto French soil for the first time in 10 months, commands fewer soldiers than a regimental colonel. Against him stand the resources of the restored monarchy, 200,000 troops, the loyalty of the great powers, the apparent acceptance of war-weary France. Yet within 20 days, this impossible gamble will place him once more upon the throne of France. The march from the coast to Paris becomes a triumphal procession that defies every calculation of political science. At Cannes, the local garrison joins Napoleon without firing a shot. At Gap, townspeople tear down royal proclamations and replace them with imperial eagles. At Grenoble, the fortress that guards the Alpine passes opens its gates while the commander offers his services to the returned emperor. But the true test comes at Laffrey, where the 5th Regiment of the line awaits with loaded muskets and orders to arrest the Corsican adventurer. Napoleon, wearing the grey coat that has become more famous than any crown, walks alone toward the leveled bayonets. Soldiers of the 5th, his voice carries across the morning air, I am your emperor. If there is one among you who wishes to kill his emperor, here I am. The silence stretches like eternity. Then, with a roar that echoes off the Alpine peaks, the regiment breaks ranks and rushes to embrace their former commander.
Vive l'empereur!
The cry that once echoed from Moscow to Madrid rises again from French throats. The Bourbon fleur-de-lis disappears beneath a forest of tricolor cockades. Marshal Ney, the bravest of the brave, has promised Louis XVIII that he will bring Napoleon back to Paris in an iron cage. Instead, meeting his former emperor at Auxerre, he falls to his knees and pledges his sword once more to the imperial service. The man who earned his reputation charging Austrian squares at Austerlitz cannot resist the magnetic pull of his old commander. By March 20th, Napoleon enters Paris in triumph, while Louis XVIII flees toward the Belgian frontier with the precipitate haste that characterized his family's responses to crisis. The Tuileries, which had witnessed foreign occupation just 10 months earlier, once again echoes with the footsteps of the man who made it an imperial palace. The impossible has occurred. Napoleon has reconquered France without fighting a battle. Yet the very speed of his restoration conceals fatal weaknesses. The France that welcomes him back is not the France of Austerlitz or even of the desperate defense of 1814. War weariness permeates the population like a fever. The bourgeoisie, though dissatisfied with Bourbon rule, craves peace and prosperity rather than military glory. The peasantry, having gained their land through revolution, fears any disruption that might threaten their holdings. More critically, Europe reacts to Napoleon's return with unanimous hostility. The Congress of Vienna, despite its internal quarrels, unites instantly against the common threat. The Treaty of Alliance, signed within days of news from France reaching Vienna, commits Britain, Russia, Austria, and Prussia to field 600,000 men for Napoleon's final destruction. This is not 1805, when coalition warfare suffered from divided councils and competing objectives. This is 1815, when all of Europe understands that only Napoleon's complete elimination can guarantee lasting peace. The weeks following Napoleon's restoration pass in frantic preparation for the inevitable conflict. French arsenals, depleted by the disasters of 1813 to 1814, somehow produce arms for new armies. Veterans of 20 campaigns emerge from retirement to serve their emperor once more. Young men who had hoped never to hear the drum roll of conscription find themselves donning uniforms and learning the manual of arms. Yet the army Napoleon assembles for his final campaign, though enthusiastic, cannot match the Grande Armée of his glory days. Many of his finest marshals are Dedlons at Aspern-Essling, Duroc at Bautzen, Bessirez at Rippock. Others, like Bernadotte and Marmont, have chosen accommodation with the new order. Those who remain, though loyal, are aging men whose fire burns less brightly than in their youth. Napoleon's strategic situation in June 1815 would challenge even his genius at its peak. Coalition armies converge on France from every direction: Wellington's Anglo-Dutch forces in Belgium, Blücher's Prussians in the Rhineland, Schwarzenberg's Austrians in the south, Russian masses marching westward from Poland. Against these overwhelming numbers, Napoleon can field perhaps 125,000 men in his main army, with inadequate reserves and uncertain communications. His only hope lies in the interior line strategy that served him so well in the campaigns of 1796 and 1814. Strike swiftly at separated enemy forces before they can unite, defeat them in detail, then turn against the next threat. The plan requires perfect timing, flawless execution, and considerable luck. But Napoleon has attempted impossible gambles before and seen them crowned with success. The advance into Belgium begins on June 15th with all the secrecy and speed that characterized Napoleon's greatest campaigns. The Army of the North, marching in 3 columns, crosses the frontier before Wellington or Blücher fully understands what is happening. French cavalry, probing northward through the Belgian countryside, reports that the coalition forces remain scattered across a wide front, vulnerable to concentrated attack. At Ligny on June 16th, Napoleon wins his last victory over Blücher's Prussians. The battle, though smaller than the great encounters of previous years, demonstrates that the emperor's tactical genius remains undimmed by exile and advancing age. Prussian infantry, advancing in columns that recall the formations of Frederick the Great, crumble before concentrated French artillery fire. Blücher himself, crushed beneath his falling horse, barely escapes capture. Yet even victory carries the seeds of defeat. The Prussian army, though beaten, retreats in good order toward Wavre rather than fleeing eastward toward Germany. This retreat, though seemingly favorable to French interests, keeps Blücher's forces within supporting distance of Wellington's army near Brussels. Napoleon, focused on his immediate tactical success, fails to grasp the strategic implications of his enemy's withdrawal route. Meanwhile, at Quatre-Bras, Marshal Ney engages Wellington's advance guard in a battle that achieves nothing decisive for either side. The Iron Duke, that methodical master of defensive warfare, falls back toward a position he has reconnoitered months earlier, a low ridge south of a village called Waterloo. Ney, despite local superiority in numbers, cannot prevent this withdrawal or inflict crippling casualties on the retreating Anglo-Dutch forces. The morning of June 18, 1815, dawns gray and wet over the Belgian countryside. The thunderstorm of the previous night has turned roads into quagmires and fields into swamps, but neither army shows any inclination to postpone the decisive encounter. Wellington, positioned on the reverse slope of the Mont Saint-Jean Ridge, awaits attack with 68,000 men of mixed-quality British veterans, Dutch-Belgian conscripts, German mercenaries, Nassau volunteers. Napoleon, surveying the battlefield from the Inn of La Belle Alliance, commands 72,000 troops and enjoys slight numerical superiority. But his forces, though enthusiastic, lack the overwhelming quality advantages that characterized the Grande Armée in its prime. Many regiments consist of raw recruits or recalled veterans whose skills have rusted during years of peace. The artillery, though numerous, lacks the experienced gunners who once made French batteries the terror of Europe. The emperor's plan for the battle reflects both his strategic acumen and his dangerous overconfidence. A diversionary attack on Hougoumont Château will draw Wellington's reserves westward. The main assault, delivered by d'Erlin's I Corps, will break the Allied center while cavalry exploitation completes the victory. Once Wellington's army is destroyed, Napoleon can turn against Blücher's approaching Prussians with decisive force. But from the opening shots, the battle develops along lines that Napoleon has not anticipated. The diversionary attack on Hougoumont becomes a major engagement that consumes thousands of French troops without achieving its objective. British guardsmen, fighting from behind stone walls and garden hedges, hold their position with the tenacity that has made their nation's infantry famous across Europe. d'Erlin's grand assault, launched at 1:30 p.m. with all the pageantry of Napoleonic warfare, meets disaster through a combination of tactical errors and British resilience. French columns, advancing in formations that have conquered Europe, find themselves raked by artillery fire from guns they cannot see. British infantry, deployed in the thin red lines that Wellington has perfected, deliver volleys that tear gaps in French ranks. The British cavalry charge that shatters d'Erlin's assault ranks among the most spectacular actions in military history. The Household and Union brigades, charging downhill with sabers flashing in the watery sunlight, sweep through French infantry like scythes through wheat. For a moment, it seems as though Wellington has won the battle with a single devastating blow. Yet the British cavalry, intoxicated by success, presses its charge too far. French lancers and cuirassiers, rallying from their initial surprise, exact terrible revenge on horsemen who have outrun their supports. The brigades that began the charge as elite formations limp back to their lines as broken remnants. Wellington's offensive capability, never strong, disappears in the mud of Belgian fields. The afternoon stretches into a stalemate that favors neither side decisively. French artillery, redeployed for maximum effect, pounds the Allied line with shot and shell. British infantry, lying down behind the ridge crest, endures bombardment with the stoicism that has carried them through the Peninsula campaigns. Casualties mount steadily, but neither army shows signs of collapse. Napoleon, suffering from illness and uncharacteristic indecision, fails to exploit fleeting opportunities that might have brought victory. The great cavalry charges led by Murat's replacement prove magnificent spectacles but achieve no lasting tactical advantage. British squares, bristling with bayonets, stand firm against repeated attacks by the finest horsemen in Europe. As the afternoon wears on, the sound of distant gunfire announces Blücher's approach. The Prussian army, despite its defeat at Ligny, has executed a forced march that brings 30,000 fresh troops to Wellington's aid. Napoleon, facing the nightmare scenario of fighting two armies simultaneously, must achieve victory quickly or accept inevitable defeat. The final crisis comes with the Imperial Guard's assault on Wellington Center. These veterans of 20 campaigns, the men who have never known defeat, advance up the slope of Mont Saint-Jean with the confidence of soldiers who have conquered Europe. Their blue uniforms and bearskin caps, famous from Spain to Russia, promise final victory to French hopes. But the Guard meets its match in British veterans who have learned their trade in the harsh school of Peninsula warfare. Maitland's Guardsmen, rising from the tall grain where they have lain concealed, deliver point-blank volleys that stagger the advancing French columns. For the first time in their illustrious history, the Imperial Guard recoils from an enemy's fire.
La garde recule.
The cry spreads through French ranks like wildfire. If the Guard can be beaten, if these invincible veterans can retreat, then perhaps the battle is lost. Panic, that most contagious of military diseases, spreads through the Army of the North with devastating speed. Wellington, seizing the psychological moment, orders his entire line forward. The thin red line that has held Mont Saint-Jean throughout the afternoon becomes a tide of British infantry sweeping down the reverse slope. Prussian columns, approaching from the east, add their weight to the general advance. The French army, victorious in 100 battles, dissolves in rout and panic. Napoleon, watching his final gamble collapse, makes one last attempt to rally his forces. Mounting his horse, he rides toward the advancing enemy with the handful of guardsmen who remain faithful. For a moment, it seems he will seek the death in battle that has so often eluded him. But his companions, understanding the Empire's need for his survival, forcibly escort him from the field. The retreat from Waterloo becomes a rout that surpasses even the disasters of Leipzig and the Russian campaign. French soldiers, throwing away weapons and equipment, flee toward France in hopeless disorder. The army that Napoleon has cobbled together for his final campaign simply ceases to exist as an organized force. In the farmhouse of Cailloux, where he had spent the previous night confident of victory, Napoleon drafts his second abdication. The words come slowly, each phrase an admission of dreams dead and empires fallen. Having sacrificed all our interests to those of the country, I declare my readiness to quit the throne, my life, and my country, for the good of France. The 100 days end where they began, with Napoleon as an exile, but this time without hope of return. The gamble that began with 7 ships and 1,000 men concludes with the destruction of the last French army and the emperor's final abdication. Europe, which has trembled before French arms for 23 years, can finally rest secure in the knowledge that the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars are truly ended. The eagles that flew from Elba to Waterloo fold their wings forever. The empire that stretched from Cadiz to Warsaw shrinks to the dimensions of a British prison ship. The man who crowned himself emperor, who made kings of his brothers and marshals of his sergeants, becomes once more what he had been at the beginning, a prisoner of his enemies, waiting for whatever fate they choose to impose. But in those 100 days, Napoleon has written the final chapter of his legend. The impossible return from Elba, the reconquest of France without a battle, the final desperate gamble at Waterloo. These events possess a romantic grandeur that no mere recitation of victories can match. He has failed magnificently, and in failure has achieved a different kind of immortality. The boy from Corsica, who dared to challenge the world and nearly won, faces his final journey to a prison more secure than Elba. But his legend, forged in 20 years of war and sealed by 100 days of impossible dreams, will outlive all the dynasties he overthrew and all the empires that conspired against him. The candle flame gutters and nearly dies, struggling against the darkness that presses in from all sides like the armies of the Sixth Coalition. 9. St. Helena, 1815 to 1821. On a rock in the Atlantic, the Eagle learned to die. The ship HMS Northumberland cuts through the South Atlantic swells with the methodical persistence of British naval power, carrying its most precious cargo toward the end of the world. On deck, wrapped in the gray coat that has become his trademark, Napoleon Bonaparte watches the horizon with eyes that have seen Moscow burn and Austerlitz won. But now those eyes search for something else entirely, the first glimpse of St. Helena, the rock that will become his tomb. October 15, 1815. The island rises from the ocean like a monument to isolation, its volcanic cliffs ascending nearly vertically from waters that stretch unbroken to every horizon. This speck of British territory, 1,200 miles from the nearest continental shore, 700 miles from the closest inhabited land, represents the ultimate refinement of imprisonment. Here, surrounded by an ocean more effective than any fortress wall, the master of Europe will spend his final years counting the days until death. Longwood House, Napoleon's designated residence, perches on the island's windswept plateau like an afterthought to colonial administration. Built originally as quarters for the lieutenant governor's guests, the house consists of little more than a dozen rooms arranged around a central courtyard. The walls, constructed of local stone and painted white to reflect the tropical sun, bear no resemblance to the palaces of the Tuileries or Schönbrunn. Here, the man who once held court for kings of Europe will receive visitors in a drawing room barely large enough for a regimental mess. Sir Hudson Lowe, appointed as Napoleon's jailer with all the meticulous care that British bureaucracy can muster, arrives at St. Helena in April 1816 with instructions that leave nothing to chance. The prisoner, for that is how British authorities refer to the former emperor, must be kept under constant surveillance. His correspondence will be censored. His movements will be restricted. His very identity will be denied, for to British officials he is not Napoleon I, Emperor of the French, but merely General Bonaparte, a designation calculated to wound his pride more than any physical restraint. The psychological warfare between captor and captive begins immediately. Lowe, a career soldier whose competence exceeds his imagination, approaches his duties with the literal mindedness that has made British administration famous throughout the empire. Every regulation must be enforced, every protocol observed, every detail documented. He fails to understand that he guards not just a man but a legend, not just a prisoner but the living embodiment of 25 years of European convulsion. Napoleon's response to this petty tyranny reveals both his greatness and his limitations. Unable to command armies or reshape maps, he wages war with the weapons available to him: words, gestures, the careful cultivation of martyrdom. His refusal to acknowledge British authority becomes a daily ritual of defiance. When Lowe insists on addressing him as General Bonaparte, Napoleon retorts that he knows no such person. I am Napoleon, Emperor of the French, or nothing at all. The establishment of his miniature court at Longwood demonstrates Napoleon's genius for creating meaning from the most unpromising materials. His companions in exile, Bertrand, Montholin, Las Cases, Gourgaud, receive titles and responsibilities that echo the great offices of empire. Las Cases becomes his Secretary of State, responsible for correspondence with the outside world. Bertrand serves as Grand Marshal of the Palace, managing a household that consists of 36 people. Even the arrangement of furniture in Longwood's cramped rooms follows the protocol of imperial courts. Yet beneath this elaborate charade lies a more profound project, the construction of the Napoleonic legend. In the long afternoons when the South Atlantic wind rattles Longwood's windows, Napoleon begins the most important campaign of his career, the conquest of posterity's judgment. Dictating to Las Cases and later to other secretaries, he shapes the narrative that will define his historical reputation for generations to come. The memorial of St. Helena, emerging from these dictation sessions like a great cathedral built one stone at a time, transforms military defeats into moral victories, political failures into historical necessities. The retreat from Moscow becomes a strategic withdrawal. The disasters of 1813 to 1814 become the inevitable result of European jealousy. The 100 Days become not a desperate gamble but a democratic mandate from the French people. With each carefully crafted phrase, Napoleon rewrites the history he lived, creating a legend more powerful than any empire. What is history? He asks Las Cases during one of their evening sessions. But a fable agreed upon? The question contains the essence of his St. Helena strategy. Unable to change the past, he will control its interpretation. Unable to rule nations, he will govern memory. The man who once commanded 600,000 soldiers now commands only words, but he wields them with the same tactical brilliance that once won Austerlitz. The climate of St. Helena proves as hostile as its isolation. The island's position in the South Atlantic trade winds creates a peculiar microclimate, perpetually humid, often foggy, subject to sudden changes that seem designed to torment European constitutions. Napoleon, accustomed to the varied seasons of France and the dry heat of Egypt and Italy, finds himself battling an enemy more insidious than any coalition army. The damp air aggravates old wounds and creates new ailments. The monotonous weather breeds melancholy more effectively than any dungeon. Yet even physical discomfort cannot dim the intellectual energy that has driven Napoleon since his youth. In Longwood's small library, assembled from books donated by sympathizers and borrowed from the island's meager resources, he conducts a university education in reverse. Reading the classics he had neglected during his years of action, studying the histories of empires he had surpassed, analyzing the literature of nations he had conquered, Napoleon becomes the scholar he might have been if Corsica had remained at peace. His conversations, recorded by his secretaries with the devotion of apostles preserving scripture, reveal a mind still capable of penetrating insight and startling synthesis. Discussing Caesar's commentaries, he notes the Romans' inability to create lasting institutions. Analyzing Alexander's conquests, he observes that the Macedonian empire died with its creator because it lacked administrative foundations. These observations, seemingly academic, actually constitute Napoleon's defense of his own historical role. He built not just an empire but a system of laws, institutions, and ideas that would survive military defeat. The arrival of Hudson Lowe creates a new dynamic at Longwood that combines elements of farce and tragedy. The governor, convinced that his prisoner represents a continuing threat to European peace, surrounds Napoleon with restrictions that would be comical if they were not so petty. Riding beyond certain boundaries requires permission. Visitors must be approved in advance. Even the books Napoleon reads are subject to censorship, lest seditious ideas somehow escape to the outside world. Napoleon's response to these indignities provides daily entertainment for his household and weekly copy for European newspapers. When Lowe demands to inspect him personally each day to verify his continued presence, Napoleon receives the governor while bathing, forcing the embarrassed official to confirm his prisoner's identity while averting his eyes from imperial nakedness. Such scenes, recorded by Napoleon's secretaries and published in European capitals, transform the fallen emperor into a figure of romantic suffering. The departure of Las Cases in December 1816, expelled by Lowe for attempting to smuggle and censored correspondence to Europe, deprives Napoleon of his most literary collaborator but does not end the memoir project. Montholin and Gourgaud, though less polished as writers, continue the work of preserving Napoleon's version of events. The dictation sessions become the central ritual of Longwood life, providing structure to days that might otherwise dissolve in tropical lethargy. The topics of these sessions range across Napoleon's entire career, but certain themes recur with the persistence of musical motifs. The continental system, he insists, represented not economic warfare but a proto-European union designed to free the continent from British commercial domination. His wars were defensive responses to coalition aggression, attempts to preserve the gains of the revolution against monarchical reaction. His legal and administrative reforms, not his military victories, constitute his true claim to historical greatness. The writing process itself becomes a form of therapy for a man condemned to inaction. Napoleon, who once complained that 24 hours were insufficient for the business of empire, now finds himself with unlimited time and diminishing energy. The careful construction of each paragraph, the precise choice of each word, the constant revision and refinement of arguments provide the intellectual challenge his active mind requires. European reaction to these literary productions reveals the continuing power of Napoleon's name. Banned books sell for enormous prices. Smuggled manuscripts circulate through aristocratic salons like revolutionary pamphlets. Publishers compete for fragments of text that might contain the emperor's thoughts on contemporary affairs. The man who once terrified Europe with his armies now disturbs the peace with his pen. The years pass with the slow rhythm of tropical seasons, marked more by the deterioration of Napoleon's health than by external events. The stomach ailments that plagued him during his active career worsen under St. Helena's humid climate and monotonous diet. The liver problems that may have contributed to his erratic behavior during the 1812 Russian campaign manifest themselves in increasingly frequent attacks of nausea and pain. Yet even physical decline cannot entirely dim the intellectual fire that burns within him. His analysis of contemporary European politics, based on newspapers and correspondence from visitors, demonstrates an understanding of continental affairs that exceeds that of most serving statesmen. His predictions about future European development, the rise of nationalism, the decline of absolute monarchy, the eventual unification of Germany and Italy prove remarkably prescient. The arrival of new books from Europe provides periodic excitement for Longwood's residents. Napoleon devours historical works that analyze his own career, annotating their margins with corrections, clarifications, and rebuttals. His comments on these texts, preserved by his secretaries, constitute a running dialogue with posterity about the meaning of his life and achievements. His interest in contemporary literature reveals unexpected depths of sensitivity. Reading Walter Scott's novels, he appreciates the Scottish author's romantic portrayal of lost causes and doomed heroes. Studying Byron's poetry, he recognizes a kindred spirit in the English lord's celebration of individual genius and defiance of conventional morality. These literary encounters provide Napoleon with new vocabulary for expressing his own sense of tragic destiny. The death of Marie-Louise's affections, though not unexpected, strikes Napoleon with surprising force. News that his Habsburg wife has taken an Austrian lover and shows no interest in joining him in exile confirms what he had long suspected, that their marriage was a political arrangement that could not survive political catastrophe. Yet the final severing of this bond leaves him feeling more isolated than any ocean could accomplish. More painful still are the reports about his son, the King of Rome, now growing up in Austrian custody as the Duke of Reichstadt. Napoleon's letters to the boy, intercepted and censored by Metternich's agents, never reach their intended recipient. The father who dreamed of founding a dynasty must content himself with imagining a son he will never see again, who will grow up speaking German rather than French, who will learn to think of his father as a distant historical figure rather than a living parent. The establishment of new European boundaries at the Congress of Vienna provides Napoleon with ample material for sardonic commentary. His former enemies, having disposed of the revolutionary threat, immediately fall to quarreling among themselves about the spoils of victory. The Holy Alliance between Russia, Austria, and Prussia, ostensibly designed to preserve Christian principles in international relations, becomes a transparent mechanism for suppressing liberal movements throughout Europe. Napoleon's analysis of these developments, dictated to his secretaries with the detachment of an observer rather than a participant, reveals his continued understanding of European power dynamics. He predicts that the Vienna settlement cannot last because it ignores the forces of nationalism and liberalism that his own career had unleashed. The map of Europe, redrawn by conservative diplomats, will be redrawn again by peoples demanding self-determination and constitutional government. The gradual departure of his companions adds new dimensions to Napoleon's isolation. Gourgaud, driven to desperation by the claustrophobic atmosphere of Longwood, requests permission to leave St. Helena in 1818. Las Casas is already gone. Other members of the household depart for reasons ranging from illness to financial necessity. Each departure diminishes not only Napoleon's circle of companionship but also his connection to the outside world. Yet Napoleon's capacity for creating meaning from limited circumstances remains undiminished. His daily routine, carefully structured despite the absence of external obligations, provides stability in an environment that could easily promote despair. Morning dictation sessions with whatever secretary remains available. Afternoon walks in Longwood's limited grounds, carefully measured to remain within British restrictions. Evening conversations that range across philosophy, history, literature, and politics. The approach of his 50th birthday in August 1819 prompts Napoleon to reflect on the trajectory of his extraordinary life. Half a century earlier, he was born the second son of a Corsican lawyer in a house barely large enough for a single family. Now he sits in forced retirement on an Atlantic island, his name known throughout the civilized world, his career studied in every military academy, his legal code adopted by dozens of nations. The accounting seems favorable despite its tragic conclusion. He has traveled further and achieved more than any man since Alexander the Great. He has witnessed the death of the old Europe and presided over the birth of the new. He has transformed the art of war, the science of administration, and the practice of diplomacy. If his empire has fallen, his influence on human civilization remains permanent and pervasive. The final years of Napoleon's life pass in increasing physical decline and spiritual serenity. The stomach ailments that have plagued him for years worsen into something more serious, possibly cancer, though the limited medical knowledge available on St. Helena makes precise diagnosis impossible. British physicians, hampered by their patient suspicion and their own limited expertise, can offer little beyond palliative care. Yet even approaching death cannot silence Napoleon's interest in the world beyond St. Helena. European newspapers, arriving weeks late on British ships, provide continuing material for his analysis of contemporary affairs. The revolutions beginning to stir across southern Europe particularly capture his attention. Here are the forces he had predicted, the nationalism and liberalism that his own career had awakened finally asserting themselves against the Vienna settlement. His final dictation sessions, recorded by the faithful Montholin, take on an increasingly philosophical character. The man who once moved armies like chess pieces now contemplates the larger patterns of human history. The French Revolution, he concludes, was inevitable, the product of social and economic forces that no individual could have controlled. His own role was not to create these forces but to channel them, to give them direction and purpose, to prevent their energy from dissipating in anarchy. The writing of his will becomes Napoleon's final act of imperial administration. With the same attention to detail that once characterized his military planning, he distributes his few remaining possessions among faithful servants and loyal friends. His sword goes to his son, though he knows the boy will never receive it. His personal effects are divided among companions who shared his exile. Even his body becomes a political statement. He requests burial in France. On the banks of the Seine, among the French people I have loved so well, the final weeks pass in increasing weakness but mental clarity that astonishes his attendants. Napoleon, who once commanded the attention of Europe through military genius, now holds his small audience through the power of personality alone. His conversations, though less frequent and more labored, retain their characteristic blend of analysis and insight, humor and melancholy. On May 5, 1821, as the South Atlantic winter begins its annual assault on St. Helena, Napoleon Bonaparte closes his eyes for the last time. Outside Longwood House, British sentries maintain their watch over a prisoner who no longer requires guarding. The man who once made Europe tremble dies as quietly as any private citizen, attended only by servants and a French priest who grants him the last rites of the Catholic Church he had restored to France. The autopsy, conducted by British and French doctors, reveals a stomach riddled with disease that had caused years of suffering. But the true cause of Napoleon's death was neither cancer nor poison nor any physical ailment that medical science could identify. He died of St. Helena, of isolation, of inactivity, of the slow strangulation of a spirit that required challenge and movement to survive. The funeral, conducted according to British military protocols, possesses none of the grandeur that marked Napoleon's life. No artillery salutes echo across the Atlantic. No crowned heads send representatives to pay their respects. The coffin, constructed of local wood and lined with lead, descends into St. Helena soil while British soldiers present arms and a small congregation of exiles and officials recites the prayers for the dead. Yet even in death, Napoleon demonstrates his genius for capturing human imagination. The news of his passing, reaching Europe after weeks of ocean travel, produces reactions that reveal his continuing hold on contemporary consciousness. His enemies, who spent years fearing his return, discover that his death creates new anxieties about his historical reputation. His admirers, who had preserved hope for his eventual restoration, find in martyrdom a more powerful inspiration than living leadership might have provided. The legend that Napoleon carefully constructed during his St. Helena years begins its conquest of European consciousness with the efficiency that once characterized his military campaigns. The memorial, published in installments across European capitals, provides the canonical version of events that will influence historical interpretation for generations. The man who failed to create a lasting dynasty succeeds in creating a lasting myth. In Paris, where the Bourbon Restoration continues its difficult experiment in returning to the past, Napoleon's former soldiers gather in cafes and wine shops to reminisce about campaigns they fought under the imperial eagles. In Poland, where dreams of independence remain alive despite Russian occupation, Napoleon's name becomes synonymous with liberation. In Germany and Italy, where nationalism stirs beneath the surface of restored monarchies, the emperor who had unified these fragmented regions becomes a symbol of future unity. The boy from Corsica, who rose higher than any man since Caesar and fell further than any hero since Troy, had achieved in death what even his genius could not accomplish in life: immortality. His body rests in St. Helena soil, but his spirit has escaped that Atlantic prison to wander through human memory and imagination. He had crossed the Rhine and the Alps, the Nile and the Niemen, but his greatest journey lies ahead, the passage from history into legend, from mortality into myth. The candle gutters and dies, its flame extinguished like the life it has illuminated. But in the darkness that follows, we can still hear the echo of marching feet, the distant thunder of artillery, the whispered conversations of men who dared to follow an eagle across the world. The light has gone out, but the shadows it cast will dance through human consciousness as long as people dream of glory and mourn for fallen greatness.